My name is Charmaine. 5 years ago, my husband abandoned our blind son to be with another woman. I raised the boy entirely alone while paying off a mountain of medical debt. At 18 years old, one of his paintings just sold for $1 million at an exclusive Atlanta art gallery. Then my ex-husband came back. He walked right through the gallery doors with a ruthless lawyer demanding his share of the money. I was ready to give up just to protect my son. I told my lawyer to let him take it. But my blind son calmly stepped forward and whispered, "Let me handle this." Before I continue this incredible story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against someone who thought they could destroy your peace. The tension in that room was unforgettable, and the way my son took his father down is something you have to hear to believe. The evening began as a triumph that I had prayed for over the past 5 agonizing years. My brother-in-law, Andre, owned one of the most prestigious contemporary art galleries in the heart of downtown Atlanta. The space was magnificent with exposed brick walls, soaring ceilings, and brilliant track lighting that illuminated every piece of artwork with perfect clarity. Tonight was all about Jamal, my beautiful, resilient 18-year-old son. Jamal stood quietly near the center of the room, wearing a sharp charcoal suit that Andre had bought him specifically for this occasion. His dark glasses shielded his unseeing eyes from the flashing cameras of local art critics, but he did not need to see the room to feel its energy. He held his white cane lightly in his left hand. His right hand rested gently on the velvet rope protecting his masterpiece. The piece was titled Brilliant Darkness. It was a massive mixed media canvas spanning 6 feet across. Jamal had spent 8 months sculpting it entirely by touch. He used thick layers of oil paint, crushed clay metallic fragments, and shattered glass to create a tactile landscape of pain and survival. People who looked at it said they could feel the raw emotion bleeding from the canvas. To Jamal, it was simply the map of his survival. As a mother standing in the corner of that opulent room, watching Atlanta high society admire my boy's work, I felt a lump form in my throat. I remembered the nights I sat awake on our worn-out living room sofa, terrified of the foreclosure notices piling up on the kitchen counter. I remembered working 60-hour weeks as a real estate appraiser just to keep the lights on and pay for his specialized braille equipment. Now those struggles felt miles away. We were finally safe. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes quieted down as the auctioneer, a tall, elegant man with a booming voice, took his place at the podium. He adjusted his microphone and smiled at the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin the bidding for the crown jewel of tonight's exhibition, Brilliant Darkness, by the extraordinary Jamal. We shall start the bidding at $100,000. A paddle instantly shot up in the front row. 100,000. Another paddle raised near the back. 200,000. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird. $200,000 was more money than I had made in the last 3 years combined. But the numbers did not stop there. The wealthy collectors in the room were captivated by the story of the blind prodigy and the undeniable power of the artwork itself. 300,000. 450,000. Andre walked over and stood beside me. He placed a warm, comforting hand on my shoulder. "Look at him, Charmaine," Andre whispered, leaning in close so only I could hear. "Your boy is making history tonight. He deserves every single bit of this success." I nodded, unable to speak without sobbing. Jamal just stood there, tilting his head slightly, tracking the sound of the auctioneer's voice with a calm, peaceful expression. He looked so incredibly grown up, so completely independent. 600,000. The auctioneer called out, pointing to a woman in a dazzling red dress standing near the sculpture garden. 800,000. A deep voice countered from the exclusive VIP balcony. The room fell into a stunned hush. The rapid leaps in the bidding were absolutely staggering. Even the professional gallery staff stopped pouring drinks to watch the spectacle unfold. People were whispering eagerly to each other, completely mesmerized by the intense bidding war over my son's creation. "Do I hear 900,000? The auctioneer asked, leaning over the wooden podium with intense anticipation. A distinguished older man standing near the entrance raised his numbered paddle without a single hint of hesitation. $1 million, he said, his firm voice cutting through the silent room like a knife. The crowd gasped collectively. I grabbed Andres' arm, squeezing his jacket sleeve tight enough to leave a permanent mark. $1 million. It was a staggering sum of money that would change our lives forever. It meant Jamal would never have to worry about his financial future. It meant the heavy burdens, the sacrifices, the bitter tears, and the endless nights of terror were finally over for good. $1 million going once, the auctioneer announced, scanning the room carefully. $1 million going twice. He paused, letting the dramatic weight of the moment hang in the air. Sold for $1 million to the gentleman in the back. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down against the sound block. The sharp crack echoed through the gallery and instantly triggered an absolute explosion of applause. People were cheering loudly, raising their champagne glasses and looking at Jamal with absolute awe and deep respect. A brilliant, radiant smile finally broke across my son's handsome face. He bowed his head slightly, acknowledging the roaring applause he could hear thundering all around him. I started walking toward him, ready to wrap my arms around his shoulders and tell him how incredibly proud I was of the man he had become. But I never reached him. The heavy double-glass doors of the gallery were suddenly pushed open with such violent force that they slammed hard against the metal doorstops. The loud, jarring crash cut through the joyous applause like a chainsaw. The cheering immediately faltered. The clapping slowed to an awkward stop. One by one, the wealthy patrons turned their heads toward the front entrance, wondering who would dare disrupt such a beautiful moment. My blood ran completely cold. My feet froze instantly to the polished hardwood floor. I could not breathe. Walking confidently through the entrance, acting as if he owned the entire building, was Desmond, my ex-husband, the coward who had walked out on us 5 years ago while Jamal was lying heavily sedated in a hospital bed fighting for his life. Desmond looked entirely different from the broke, desperate, angry man I remembered. He was wearing a custom-tailored navy blue suit with a crisp silk pocket square perfectly folded at his chest. His hair was freshly faded, and he wore a heavy gold watch that caught the bright gallery track lighting. Clinging tightly to his left arm was Chloe. She was the younger woman he had left me for. She wore a tight emerald green dress that looked expensive but screamingly out of place at an elegant, refined art auction. She had a smug, victorious smirk plastered across her face as she greedily scanned the room full of rich people. Trailing closely behind the two of them was a sharp-looking man carrying a thick leather briefcase. He wore a stiff gray suit and had the cold, calculated eyes of a hungry predator. I would soon learn his name was Richard Sterling, and he was one of the most ruthless, predatory lawyers in the entire state of Georgia. The silence in the gallery was absolute and suffocating. You could hear a pin drop on the floorboards. The warm, celebratory energy in the room shifted instantly to something deeply uncomfortable and highly volatile. Andre immediately stepped in front of me, his fierce, protective instincts flaring up. He crossed his strong arms over his chest and glared intensely at Desmond. "What the hell are you doing here, Desmond?" Andre demanded, his voice low and incredibly dangerous. "This is a private, exclusive event. You need to turn around and walk right back out those doors before I have my security team throw you face first onto the pavement outside." Desmond completely ignored Andre. He did not even bother to look at him. Instead, Desmond casually let go of Chloe's arm and walked slowly, deliberately toward the center of the room. He walked straight toward Jamal. He moved with a sickening confidence, a disgusting swagger that made my stomach turn over in absolute disgust. Jamal had stopped smiling entirely. His heightened hearing had already picked up the familiar heavy rhythm of those footsteps. I saw my son's jaw tighten defensively. His hand gripped his white cane so hard his knuckles turned bone white. He stood perfectly still, waiting for the monster from our past to approach. Desmond stopped just a few feet away from Jamal. He looked up at the massive textured painting, then looked back down at his blind son. He smiled a wide, fake smile that was clearly designed to manipulate the large audience of wealthy collectors currently watching their every single move. "Congratulations, son," Desmond said, his loud voice echoing aggressively in the quiet gallery. It is a beautiful piece of art, really incredible work. I always knew you had it in you. I pushed forcefully past Andre and stepped directly between Desmond and Jamal. My heart was racing frantically, but I forced my posture to remain perfectly straight and unshaken. I tilted my chin up and looked directly into the soulless eyes of the man who had selfishly destroyed our family. "Get away from him," I commanded, my voice steady and freezing cold. "You have absolutely no right to be here tonight. You have no right to speak to him." Desmond chuckled lightly, casually adjusting his expensive suit jacket. "Now, Charmaine, let us not cause an ugly scene in front of all these nice, important people. I am just a proud, loving father coming to celebrate his amazing boy's massive success. $1 million. That is quite a huge milestone for an 18-year-old kid." He took a threatening step closer, looking completely past me to stare at Jamal. "I am so incredibly proud of you, son." Desmond continued, his tone dripping with fake, sickening affection. "And I am here for my cut." The absolute audacity of his statement hung in the air like toxic smoke. The entire room braced for impact. The man who had refused to pay a single dime of child support was now demanding half of a fortune he did nothing to earn. He stood there smiling, waiting for us to completely break down. My response was immediate. I stepped fully into his personal space, my voice low enough to avoid screaming, but sharp enough to slice through the heavy silence. "Get out," I said. "You abandoned your son 5 years ago. You left when he was lying in the intensive care unit, hooked up to machines fighting for his very life. You walked out the door and never looked back." Desmond held up his hands defensively, playing to the crowd. He looked around the room, putting on his best performance of a wounded, misunderstood man. "Now, Nia," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Let us not air our dirty laundry in front of all these nice people. We had our differences, but I am still his father. A father has a right to be here for his son's big moment." "A right," I laughed, but there was zero humor in it. "A right. Where was your right as a father when I was signing a second mortgage on my house to cover $150,000 in medical bills? Where were your parental rights when I was working 60 hours a week as a real estate appraiser just so Jamal could have specialized braille training? You lost your rights the day you walked out on your family to play house with her." I gestured sharply toward Chloe. She shifted uncomfortably under the intense glare of the wealthy gallery patrons, but quickly regained her arrogant smirk. "You are just a bitter ex-wife," Nia, Desmond shot back, his voice tightening. "You always were. You could never stand to see me succeed, and now you are trying to poison my son against me." "Poison him," I said, my voice steady and icy. "You poisoned yourself, Desmond. You showed him exactly who you are. Now get out of this gallery before I have security drag you out." Desmond did not move. He did not retreat. Instead, he turned his attention back to Jamal, who was still gripping his white cane, standing perfectly still amidst the chaos. "Jamal," Desmond said, softening his voice, trying to sound warm and fatherly. "Do not listen to her. You know I love you, son. I have always loved you." Jamal did not turn his head toward his father's voice. He simply adjusted his grip on his cane, his face completely unreadable. "If you loved me," Jamal said, his voice surprisingly strong and calm, "you would not be here demanding money you did not earn." A murmur ran through the crowd. Desmond's face flushed with anger, but he quickly masked it with a tight, strained smile. He realized his emotional manipulation was not working. He could not play the victim when his own blind son was calling him out in front of Atlanta's elite. He turned to the lawyer standing behind him. Richard Sterling stepped forward, his briefcase gripped tightly in his hands. "Mr. Sterling," Desmond said, his voice cold and strictly business, "show them the document." The lawyer unlatched the briefcase. The sharp click of the metal clasps echoed in the quiet room, sounding like a gun being cocked. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and held it up. "What is that?" Andre demanded, stepping forward again, his fists clenched at his sides. "This," the lawyer said smoothly, his voice oily and professional, "is a legally binding contract, signed by Jamal himself exactly 6 months ago." I felt the blood drain completely from my face. 6 months ago, I tried desperately to remember what had happened 6 months ago. Jamal had just turned 18 yesterday. The contract would have been signed when he was still a minor. Signed what I asked, my voice suddenly trembling, despite my best efforts to stay strong. A contract, Richard Sterling explained, pulling a crisp white document from the envelope. Granting my client Desmond here 50% of all artistic earnings and creative rights. Desmond is not just Jamal's father. He is his primary financial backer. His angel investor. An angel investor. I repeated the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. You have not given him a single dime in 5 years. Oh, but I have, Desmond interrupted, his arrogant smirk returning. I bought the very materials he used to create this masterpiece. The paints, the clay, the canvases. I provided the foundation for his success. It was a blatant lie, a disgusting, easily disprovable lie, but the document in the lawyer's hand looked terrifyingly real. I could see a signature scrawled across the bottom line. It looked like Jamal's handwriting. Let me see that, I demanded, reaching for the paper. Richard Sterling quickly pulled it back out of my reach. I am afraid I cannot let you do that, ma'am. This is a private legal document between my client and his son. He is my son, I snapped, my voice rising. And he is blind. How could he possibly know what he was signing? Because I read it to him, Desmond said smoothly, lying through his teeth. I came to visit him. We had a nice long talk about his future. He knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted his father to be part of his career. I turned slowly to look at Jamal. My brilliant, strong, independent boy looked suddenly very small and very vulnerable. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle ticked in his cheek. Jamal, I whispered, my heart breaking. Is this true? Did you sign something? Jamal swallowed hard. His unseeing eyes stared straight ahead, but I could see the subtle signs of panic in his posture. He came to the house, Jamal said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. You were at work, Mom. He brought a package. He said it was an early birthday present. Art supplies. He gave me a card with braille on it. It said he loved me and wanted to support my art. My stomach churned violently. Desmond had planned this. He had waited until I was working one of my grueling 12-hour shifts. He had snuck into our home and manipulated our blind son. He said I needed to sign a delivery receipt for the package, Jamal continued, his voice steadying. The delivery guy was waiting, he said. You bastard, I hissed, turning back to Desmond. My hands were shaking with pure, unadulterated rage. You tricked a blind boy into signing away half his future. You are a monster. Desmond laughed, a cold, cruel sound that echoed in the high-ceilinged gallery. A monster. No, Naya. I am a businessman and a legally recognized partner in this venture. Now, about that $1 million, I believe half of it belongs to me. I stepped fully into his personal space, my voice low enough to avoid screaming, but sharp enough to slice through the heavy silence. Get out, I said. You abandoned your son 5 years ago. You left when he was lying in the intensive care unit, hooked up to machines, fighting for his very life. You walked out the door and never looked back. Desmond held up his hands defensively, playing to the crowd. He looked around the room, putting on his best performance of a wounded, misunderstood man. Now, Nia, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Let us not air our dirty laundry in front of all these nice people. We had our differences, but I am still his father. A father has a right to be here for his son's big moment. A right, I laughed, but there was zero humor in it. Where was your right as a father when I was signing a second mortgage on my house to cover $150,000 in medical bills? Where were your parental rights when I was working 60 hours a week as a real estate appraiser just so Jamal could have specialized braille training? You lost your rights the day you walked out on your family to play house with her. I gestured sharply toward Chloe. She shifted uncomfortably under the intense glare of the wealthy gallery patrons, but quickly regained her arrogant smirk. You are just a bitter ex-wife, Nia, Desmond shot back, his voice tightening. You always were. You could never stand to see me succeed, and now you are trying to poison my son against me. Poison him, I said, my voice steady and icy. You poisoned yourself, Desmond. You showed him exactly who you are. Now get out of this gallery before I have security drag you out. Desmond did not move. He did not retreat. Instead, he stood there looking incredibly pleased with himself. Before I could respond to his absolute insanity, Chloe decided it was her turn to step into the spotlight. She let go of Desmond's arm and strutted forward. Her high heels clicked obnoxiously against the hardwood floor. She walked right up to the velvet rope protecting Jamal's painting. "Do not touch that," Andre barked, stepping forward. Chloe smirked and leaned over the rope, intentionally hovering her manicured fingers just inches away from the textured canvas. "It is just a bunch of dirt and broken glass," she sneered, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "But if some fool in this room is willing to pay $1 million for it, then Desmond and I are absolutely taking our rightful share. And quite frankly, Nia, half of the money is not going to be enough to settle what you owe us." "Owe you?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Chloe crossed her arms, her cheap perfume wafting through the gallery. "Desmond used our joint bank account to buy those art supplies for Jamal. That means I am an investor too. And since you have been living rent-free in that big, beautiful house in the suburbs while Desmond had to rebuild his life from scratch, we have decided we want equity in the property." The sheer audacity of her words felt like a physical blow to my chest. She was standing in my brother-in-law's gallery wearing a dress paid for by my ex-husband, demanding the house that I had nearly lost to foreclosure because of them. "You want equity in my house?" I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and pure rage. "I paid the mortgage, I paid the medical bills. I paid for everything while you two were busy taking vacations to Miami." Desmond stepped up beside Chloe, placing a protective hand on her waist. "Now, Naya, there is no need to get hostile. We are just talking business. The law is the law. Marital assets are marital assets, and this contract proves I was financially supporting his artistic endeavors." Andre had heard enough. He moved so fast I barely saw him step past me. He did not yell, he did not raise his hands, but the quiet fury radiating from him was enough to make Desmond take a quick step backward. "You listen to me. You pathetic excuse for a man," Andre said, his voice echoing sharply in the silent room. "You walk into my gallery acting like you own the place. You bring your mistress here trying to shake down a single mother and a blind kid. You think you are a businessman. You are nothing but a bottom-feeding scam artist who preys on his own flesh and blood." Richard Sterling, the slick lawyer, immediately stepped between them, holding up his briefcase like a shield. "I strongly advise you to step back," Sir Richard said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Threats of physical violence will not invalidate a legally binding contract." "It is fraud," I shouted, pointing at the piece of paper in his hand. "He lied to a blind boy. He told him it was a delivery receipt. That contract is completely fraudulent, and you know it." Richard Sterling adjusted his expensive silk tie. "Fraud is a very serious allegation, ma'am. One that requires extensive proof in a court of law. Do you have video evidence of this alleged deception? Do you have an independent witness who was present in the room when Jamal signed this document?" I stared at him, my heart sinking rapidly. "I was at work. Jamal was home alone. There were no cameras. There were no witnesses, just the word of a blind teenager against a man holding a signed document." Seeing my hesitation, Richard Sterling smiled a cold reptilian smile. "I thought not. Here is the reality of the situation, ma'am. My client holds a signed, notarized contract granting him 50% ownership of this artwork and all subsequent artistic earnings. If you attempt to deny him his rightful share, I will immediately file an injunction in Fulton County Court." "What does that mean?" I asked, my mouth suddenly completely dry. "It means I will freeze this entire transaction," the lawyer explained smoothly. "I will have the police come here tonight and confiscate the painting as evidence in a civil dispute. The artwork will be locked away in a dark evidence room for months, perhaps even years, while this slowly works its way through the legal system. Jamal will not see a single penny. Your brother-in-law will not see his gallery commission. And Jamal's promising new career in the art world will be completely destroyed by a massive, messy public lawsuit before it even begins." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The wealthy patrons who had been eagerly cheering just moments ago were now shifting uncomfortably, looking at us with a mixture of pity and severe distaste. The high society art world absolutely hated messy public scandals. "Excuse me," a deep voice rang out from the back of the room. It was the older gentleman who had won the auction, the man who had bid $1 million. He slowly walked forward, the crowd parting to let him through. He looked incredibly distinguished, wearing a sharp gray suit and carrying a silver-handled walking cane. "I am not interested in purchasing stolen or heavily disputed property," the buyer said, his voice firm and completely uncompromising. "I bid $1 million for a clear, undisputed title to this brilliant artwork. If there is a legal cloud hanging over this piece, I will withdraw my offer immediately. You have exactly 5 minutes to resolve this family dispute, or I am walking out that door and taking my money with me." The ultimatum dropped over me like a suffocating heavy blanket. 5 minutes. I had 5 minutes to save my son's future or watch his incredible triumph turn to ashes. Desmond looked absolutely thrilled. He turned to me, his eyes gleaming with greedy anticipation. "You hear that, Nia? 5 minutes. The clock is ticking. You can either be stubborn and watch Jamal lose everything, or you can be a smart woman and give me what is rightfully mine. Half the money. $500,000 transferred to my account by tomorrow morning. Do that, and I will gladly walk away and let him enjoy his big night." I looked at Jamal. He was standing perfectly still, his face pointed toward the floor. The bright gallery lights illuminated the slight tremor in his hands. He looked so defeated. He had poured his heart, his soul, and his trauma into that painting. It was his way of making sense of the darkness. And now his father was using it to destroy him all over again. My mind raced frantically. If we fought this in court, the lawyer fees alone would bankrupt me. The painting would be locked away. The buyer would disappear. The negative press would ruin Jamal's reputation forever. I felt the heavy, crushing weight of the strong black woman stereotype bearing down on my shoulders. I was always the one who had to fix everything. I was always the one who had to sacrifice my own pride to protect my family. I took a deep, shaky breath, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over my eyelashes. I looked at Andre, who was shaking his head slowly, begging me silently not to give in to this extortion. But I could not let Jamal's masterpiece rot in a police evidence locker. I could not let Desmond take away my son's light. I pulled my phone from my purse and dialed my own lawyer's number, ready to tell her to draft a settlement agreement. "Fine," I whispered, the word tasting like bitter poison. I looked directly into Desmond's smug, triumphant face. "You win. Take the $500,000. Take it and never come near my son again. Let him have his moment." Desmond chuckled, adjusting his silk tie. "Smart choice, Nia. I always knew you could be reasonable when your back was pushed against the wall." Richard Sterling pulled a pen from his breast pocket and began writing on the bottom of the contract. "Excellent. I will just need your signature right here, acknowledging the financial split and releasing my client from any future claims." I reached out my hand, trembling, to take the pen. My heart was breaking into a million tiny pieces. I felt completely, utterly powerless. But just as my fingers brushed the smooth metal of the pen, a sound cut through the tense silence of the gallery. Tap, tap, tap. It was the rhythmic sound of Jamal's white cane striking the hardwood floor. Jamal stepped forward, moving with a deliberate grace that commanded the attention of every single person in the room. He reached out his left hand and gently wrapped his fingers around my wrist. Just as I was about to take the pen from Richard Sterling, his touch was warm and incredibly firm. "Do not sign anything, Mom," Jamal said, his voice ringing out clear and steady. I looked up at my son. His jaw was set tight. He was no longer the frightened boy who had been trembling just a few moments ago. He turned his face toward Desmond and the lawyer. "Let me see that piece of paper," Jamal demanded, holding out his empty hand. Richard Sterling sneered and pulled the document back against his chest. "I am afraid you cannot read it, son, unless you suddenly miraculously regained your vision." The absolute cruelty of the lawyer's words caused a collective gasp to ripple through the gallery patrons. Andre took a threatening step forward, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. I threw my arm out immediately to stop him. I would not let them bait us into physical violence. I would not give them a reason to call the police and ruin this night completely. I stepped right up to the lawyer, my eyes locked onto his cold, calculating face. "Hand me the contract," I demanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous absolute zero. "I am his legal guardian and his mother. You will hand me that paper right now, or I will have Andre lock the doors and call the authorities to report you for attempting to extort a disabled minor." Richard Sterling hesitated, looking nervously at Desmond. Desmond gave a slight dismissive nod, a smug smile playing on his lips. The lawyer reluctantly handed over the document. I snatched the crisp white paper from his hands. My eyes rapidly scanned the dense legal jargon. It was a standard predatory representation agreement. It was filled with clauses granting Desmond 50% equity in all creative works produced by Jamal in perpetuity. It gave him decision-making power over gallery exhibitions. It gave him access to Jamal's financial accounts. But it was the bottom of the page that made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. Right there on the signature line was Jamal's name. It was not a forgery. As a professional real estate appraiser, I looked at signatures all day long. I studied contracts for a living. I knew my son's handwriting intimately. Because he could not see, his signature was always slightly uneven, the letters pressing heavily into the paper with a distinctive slant. This was definitely his signature. It was real. My internal monologue was screaming. I wanted to tear Desmond apart with my bare hands. I wanted to smash his smug face until he felt a fraction of the pain he had caused us over the last 5 years. But I forced my exterior to remain perfectly still. I built a thick fortress of ice around my emotions. A strong black woman does not crumble in front of her enemies. She calculates, she plans, she survives. "When did you do this?" I asked, looking up from the paper and staring directly into Desmond's eyes. Desmond adjusted his silk pocket square, looking incredibly pleased with himself. "Like I said, Nia, it was 6 months ago. A beautiful father and son bonding moment. 6 months ago," I repeated, my mind racing frantically through the calendar. 6 months ago, I was working a massive commercial appraisal project down in Alpharetta. I was pulling 12-hour shifts just to keep up with our mortgage payments. Jamal was home alone during the day, working quietly on his art in the garage studio Andre had helped us build. "You went to the house when you knew I was not there," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "You waited until I was miles away." "I went to see my son." Desmond corrected, his tone dripping with fake innocence. "I wanted to surprise him with some high-quality art supplies. You know how expensive those textured paints and molding clays can be. I was just being a supportive, loving parent." I turned to Jamal. "Did he bring you art supplies?" Jamal nodded slowly, his face pale under the bright gallery track lighting. "He came to the front door. It was a Tuesday afternoon." I recognized his voice immediately. I had not heard it in almost 5 years. The gallery was dead silent. Every wealthy collector, every art critic, every staff member was hanging on to Jamal's every word. The sheer emotional weight of the moment was suffocating. You could feel the collective heartbeat of the room slowing down as the horrific truth began to surface. I let him inside. Jamal continued, his grip tightening on his white cane. He sounded so happy to see me. He told me he had been following my art online. He said he was incredibly proud of me and wanted to help me succeed. He handed me a box. It was heavy. He said it was full of imported clay and expensive metallic pigments. "And then what happened?" I asked gently, prompting him to continue while trying to keep my voice from breaking. "He gave me a card," Jamal said, his voice wavering slightly. "A birthday card. He said he knew he had missed my last 4 birthdays, but he wanted to make it right." The front of the card had Braille punched into it. It said, "Happy birthday to my brilliant son. I love you." A woman in the front row of the crowd covered her mouth with her hand, muffling a quiet sob. The psychological manipulation was absolutely staggering. Desmond had weaponized his own son's desperate, lingering desire for a father's love. He had played on the deepest vulnerabilities of a blind teenager. "I read the Braille," Jamal said, his voice growing stronger, but laced with deep sadness. "And then he told me that the delivery driver was waiting outside in the truck. He said the art supplies were so expensive that the courier needed a direct signature on the delivery receipt to confirm the package was dropped off safely." My heart shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, a delivery receipt. He put a piece of paper down on the kitchen island, Jamal explained. He guided my hand to the bottom of the page. He placed a pen in my fingers and told me exactly where the line was. He said, "Just sign right here, son, and the supplies are all yours." Jamal turned his blind eyes toward where Desmond was standing. "I trusted you," Jamal whispered. "You were my father. Why would I ever think you were handing me a legal contract to steal my future?" Desmond did not flinch. He did not look ashamed. He actually smiled. "A signature is a signature," Jamal Desmond said coldly, stripping away the fake loving father persona entirely. "Welcome to the real world, kid. In business, you never sign something you have not read. Consider this a very valuable life lesson." "You disgust me," Andre practically growled, taking a massive step toward Desmond. "You used his blindness against him. You set up a fake delivery and tricked a visually impaired teenager into signing away half his life. That is not business, Desmond. That is pure, unadulterated evil." Chloe stepped forward, crossing her arms defensively. "Oh, please," she scoffed, rolling her heavily made-up eyes. "You people are so incredibly dramatic." Desmond provided the materials for the artwork. He secured his investment. It is standard industry practice. Nia should have taught him better financial literacy instead of coddling him and playing the victim. I turned my icy glare toward Chloe. "If you speak one more word in this gallery, I will personally drag you outside by your cheap hair extensions." I promised, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. Chloe opened her mouth to snap back, but Desmond put a hand on her arm, stopping her. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing with malicious intent. "Call it whatever you want, Nia," Desmond said, stepping closer, invading my personal space. "Call it trickery. Call it manipulation. Call it evil. I really do not care. The law does not care about your feelings. The law only cares about what is on that paper. And what is on that paper is a legally binding agreement in the state of Georgia." Richard Sterling stepped forward again, tapping his briefcase with absolute confidence. "My client is absolutely correct. Fraud by deception is notoriously difficult to prove, especially when the signing party admits to willingly placing their signature on the document. Jamal admits he signed it. He admits he accepted the goods provided. Therefore, the contract is entirely valid." I looked down at the contract in my hands. The paper felt heavy and toxic. My mind was spinning, desperately searching for a loophole, a way out of this nightmare. I was a real estate appraiser. I dealt with contracts every single day. I knew how ruthless the legal system could be when it came to signed documents. A signature was a physical bond. Breaking it required massive amounts of money time and undeniable proof. Proof we simply did not have. "You planned this from the very beginning," I said, looking at Desmond with pure disgust. "You saw that his art was starting to get attention online. You saw the articles in the local paper. You realized there was money to be made off the son you threw away like garbage." "I am a man who recognizes a good investment," Desmond replied, smoothing his silk tie, adjusting his heavy gold watch. "I planted the seed 6 months ago, and tonight I am here to harvest the crop. $1 million is a lot of money, Nia. 500,000 is my legal share. Plus, of course, 50% of whatever he makes for the rest of his career." The sheer scale of his greed was breathtaking. He did not just want to steal tonight. He wanted to chain Jamal to him forever. He wanted to siphon money off my son's talent for the rest of their lives. He wanted to profit from the very hands that he had abandoned when they were broken and bleeding. I stared at the signature on the page. Jamal had signed it. My sweet, trusting boy had written his name, believing he was receiving a gift from a father who finally loved him. Desmond had taken that pure, innocent hope and weaponized it into a legally binding trap. "You are going to burn in hell for this, Desmond," I said, my voice trembling with the sheer force of my hatred. Desmond just laughed again, a hollow, terrifying sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Maybe Nia," he replied casually, "but I will be flying there in first class." The crowd murmured in absolute disgust. Even in a room full of wealthy capitalists, Desmond's complete lack of morality was shocking. He stood there basking in the negative attention, soaking up the power he held over us. He had walked into our moment of ultimate triumph and turned it into a hostage situation. And the worst part was that he was holding all the cards. The signature was real. The contract looked ironclad. And my son was standing beside me completely silent, absorbing the agonizing reality that his father had only returned to use him. The oppressive silence in the room was suddenly broken by the sharp, obnoxious clicking of Chloe's high heels. She let go of Desmond's arm and began to slowly pace around the polished hardwood floor. She moved with an exaggerated sway of her hips, clearly enjoying the fact that every wealthy collector in the room was watching her. She walked right past me, her cheap floral perfume leaving a sickeningly sweet trail in the air. She stopped directly in front of Jamal's masterpiece. She leaned over the velvet rope that separated the crowd from the artwork. Then she did the one thing you absolutely never do in a fine art gallery. She reached out and touched it. Her long, fake acrylic nails scraped loudly against the delicate, textured surface of the clay and shattered glass. "Do not touch the artwork," I warned, my voice dangerously low. Chloe ignored me completely. She ran her fingernail over a piece of embedded metallic pigment, flaking a tiny microscopic piece of it onto the floor. "It is just dry dirt and garbage," she said. Her nose wrinkled in disgust. "I honestly cannot believe someone in this room is stupid enough to pay $1 million for a piece of trash like this. But since they are, I think we need to renegotiate our terms." "Renegotiate?" I asked, staring at her. "You and Desmond just produced a fraudulent contract claiming half of my son's money. What else could you possibly want?" Chloe turned around and leaned casually against the velvet stanchion, acting as if she were the queen of the gallery. "Well, Nia," she said, examining her manicured nails, $500,000 is a nice little payout, but we have been talking to Richard here and we realized something very important. When Desmond bought those expensive art supplies for Jamal, he used our joint checking account. That means my marital funds were used to finance this little art project. So technically, I am an investor too." I felt a fresh wave of blinding anger wash over me. "Are you out of your mind?" I asked. "You want more of his money." "I want what is fair," Chloe snapped, dropping her casual act. Her voice grew loud and shrill, echoing off the high ceilings. "For 5 years I have had to listen to Desmond complain about how he left you with that big, beautiful 4-bedroom house in the suburbs. I have had to live in the cramped 2-bedroom apartment in the city, while you got to keep the stainless steel appliances and the heated swimming pool. You have been living rent-free on his hard work." "His hard work," I repeated, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. "I paid the mortgage every single month. I worked 60 hours a week. I paid off the massive debts he left behind." Chloe waved her hand dismissively, cutting me off. "The law sees it differently, honey. The house was purchased while you two were still married. And since my money funded the art supplies that made this $1 million painting possible, I think we deserve a little extra compensation for our pain and suffering. We want the $500,000 from the auction tonight. And we want 50% equity in your house." The sheer audacity of her demand hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My house was my absolute sanctuary. It was the only place where Jamal felt completely safe and secure. I had fought tooth and nail against the bank to prevent foreclosure when Desmond abandoned us. I had skipped meals, sold my own jewelry, and worked myself to the point of total exhaustion just to keep a roof over my blind son's head. And now this woman standing in her fake designer dress was trying to take that away too. "You will never touch my house," I promised, my voice shaking with a terrifying intensity. "I will burn it to the ground before I let you have a single brick." Desmond stepped forward, stepping firmly to Chloe's side. "Now, Nia, let us not be dramatic," he said smoothly. "Chloe makes a valid legal point. Marital assets are complicated. We can either settle this quietly right now, or Richard can file the paperwork to put a lien on your property tomorrow morning. Your choice." Before I could respond, Andre finally hit his breaking point. My brother-in-law had been standing quietly off to the side, observing the entire disgusting display. Andre was a man of immense dignity and grace. He had built this gallery from the ground up, becoming one of the most respected curators in the African-American art community. He wore a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit and carried himself with an elegant, quiet power. Andre stepped directly into Desmond's path. He did not yell, he did not raise his hands, but the sheer force of his presence made Desmond involuntarily take a step backward. "You listen to me very carefully, you pathetic excuse for a man," Andre said, his voice echoing sharply in the silent room. "You walk into my gallery acting like you own the place. You bring your classless mistress here trying to shake down a single mother and a blind teenager. You think you are some kind of brilliant businessman pulling off a massive heist." Desmond puffed out his chest, trying to look intimidating. "I am a legal partner in this venture, Andre. You need to respect the contract." "Respect?" Andre laughed, a deep, booming sound that held absolutely no joy. "Respect is earned, Desmond, and you have earned nothing but my absolute disgust. Look at you. You are wearing a cheap off-the-rack suit trying to pass it off as custom tailoring. You are wearing a gold watch that I can clearly see as a counterfeit from 10 feet away. And you brought this woman in here wearing a knockoff designer dress that screams desperation and low self-esteem." Chloe's face turned bright red. Her mouth dropped open in shock. "Excuse me!" she shrieked, taking a step toward Andre. "You cannot talk to me like that. This dress cost me $800. Andre turned his piercing gaze toward her. His eyes were completely devoid of any warmth. "Then you were robbed," he stated coldly. "Because the stitching on the hem is uneven, the fabric is clearly synthetic blend, and the logo on your handbag is printed slightly off-center. You walked into a room full of people who appreciate true authenticity and high value, and you brought nothing but cheap plastic imitation." Several people in this gallery crowd actually snickered loudly. I saw two wealthy women standing near the champagne fountain whispering to each other and pointing at Chloe's bag. Chloe's confident, smug demeanor completely shattered. She looked down at her shoes, her face burning with intense humiliation. "This has nothing to do with our clothes," Desmond shouted, his facade finally cracking. His voice was laced with genuine anger. "We have a legal document. We have rights." "You have nothing in my gallery," Andre countered, stepping even closer. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous rumble. "I am the owner and chief curator of this establishment. I dictate who buys the art. I dictate who sells the art. And I absolutely dictate who is allowed to breathe the air inside this building. You came in here trying to use the law as a weapon to terrorize my sister-in-law. You thought you could use the wealthy patrons of this gallery to pressure her into a quick settlement." Desmond sneered, trying to regain his footing. "It worked, did it not? The buyer is waiting. The clock is ticking." Andre shook his head slowly, looking at Desmond with a mixture of pity and intense hatred. "You are a parasite, Desmond. You are a blood-sucking tick trying to latch on to the success of a boy you threw away. You abandoned him when he was lying in a hospital bed with bandages over his eyes. You left Nia to drown in medical debt. And now that they have climbed out of the darkness and built something beautiful, you show up demanding a paycheck." "That is enough," Richard Sterling interrupted, stepping forward and raising his briefcase like a shield. "My clients do not have to stand here and endure these personal attacks. They will endure whatever I tell them to endure while they are standing under my roof." Andre shot back his eyes, locking onto the lawyer. "And as for you, Mr. Sterling, I know your reputation. You are an ambulance-chasing bottom feeder who makes a living extorting vulnerable families. You think flashing a piece of paper in my gallery is going to scare me." Richard Sterling adjusted his silk tie, his face remaining entirely professional and completely devoid of emotion. "It is not about scaring you, sir. It is about enforcing the law." "Then enforce it from the sidewalk." Andre roared, finally raising his voice. He pointed a strong finger directly at the heavy glass doors of the gallery entrance. "Because I am officially trespassing all three of you. If you do not turn around and walk out those doors right this very second, I am calling my security team. And I promise you they will not escort you out politely. They will throw you face first onto the pavement." Desmond stood his ground, his jaw clenched tight. "You cannot kick us out, Andre. We have a financial stake in the artwork being auctioned tonight. We have a right to be here until the transaction is finalized." "You have a right to remain silent while I call the police," Andre said, pulling his phone from his inside jacket pocket. He dialed the numbers quickly, his eyes never leaving Desmond's face. "I am giving you 5 seconds to move. 5, 4, 3. Desmond looked nervously at his lawyer. Chloe was already stepping backward, her confidence completely broken by Andre's brutal teardown of her fake lifestyle. The gallery patrons watched in stunned silence as the confrontation reached its absolute boiling point. I stood beside Jamal, my heart pounding fiercely in my chest. I felt a surge of incredible gratitude for my brother-in-law. He was using his power and his privilege to shield us from the monsters trying to tear our lives apart. But even as Andre counted down, I knew in the pit of my stomach that throwing them out would not solve the underlying problem. "Wait," Richard Sterling said, holding up his hand to stop Andre from pressing the call button. He turned to Desmond and whispered something quickly in his ear. Desmond nodded, his eyes flashing with a dark, triumphant gleam. The lawyer turned back to us, his expression cold and calculating. "You can throw us out of the building. You have that right as the property owner. But you cannot throw out the law." Richard Sterling opened his briefcase right there in the middle of the standoff. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. He held them up so everyone in the room could see them clearly. "This is not just a demand letter," the lawyer announced, his voice carrying effortlessly over the tense silence. "This is a prepared injunction. If you force us to leave this gallery without a signed settlement agreement, my next stop is the night court judge in Fulton County. I will file this immediately." The threat hung heavily in the air, bringing the entire confrontation to a sudden grinding halt. Andre slowly lowered his phone, his face tightening with frustration. Chloe smirked again, regaining a fraction of her lost arrogance, and Desmond just stood there watching us realize that his trap was completely inescapable. The lawyer continued speaking, ensuring every person in the room understood the gravity of the situation. "The moment I file this injunction, the painting becomes the subject of active litigation. You will not be able to sell it. You will not be able to move it. You will not even be able to legally touch it without a court order." I looked at Jamal, who was gripping his white cane tightly. I looked at the painting representing his soul and his pain. And I realized that Andre's defense, while beautiful and necessary, had just pushed the lawyer to use his ultimate weapon. We were trapped. Richard Sterling held the thick stack of legal documents high enough for the entire room to see the official court seals stamped on the front pages. His voice was completely devoid of empathy, sounding like a machine programmed only to destroy. "If you refuse to honor my client's legally binding contract," Richard began, his words clipping through the air like bullets, "I will walk out of these doors and submit this ex parte injunction to the duty judge tonight. By tomorrow morning, a court order will be issued. The police will arrive at this gallery with a warrant. They will seize the artwork known as Brilliant Darkness. They will strip it from that wall and haul it away in the back of an evidence truck." I felt my breath catch in my throat. I looked at the painting, the delicate clay textures, the shattered glass, the hours of painstaking labor my blind son had poured into his masterpiece. The thought of rough police officers tearing it down and tossing it into a truck made me physically sick. "And it will not stop there." Richard continued, pacing slowly as he addressed the gallery patrons like a jury. "The artwork will be locked in a county evidence locker. It is not a climate-controlled vault. It is a damp, dusty warehouse in the basement of a police precinct. It will sit there alongside stolen televisions and confiscated drugs. It will sit there for months, perhaps even years, while this case crawls its way through the civil court system. By the time the judge finally issues a ruling, the painting will likely be damaged beyond repair." Andre took a step forward, his jaw clenched tight, but his voice had lost its thunderous edge. "You are bluffing, Sterling. No judge is going to grant an immediate seizure based on a questionable contract signed by a minor." Richard Sterling smiled a cold, reptilian smile. "He was 18 yesterday, Mr. Gallery Curator, but the contract was signed 6 months ago, making it an agreement in anticipation of his majority. Furthermore, my client provided the physical materials. It is a joint venture dispute. Any judge will freeze the asset to prevent its sale until ownership is fully adjudicated. That is not a bluff. That is the law of the state of Georgia." Desmond stepped out from behind his lawyer, his chest puffed out in total triumph. He looked around the room, soaking in the power he held over us. He looked at Jamal, who was standing perfectly still, his head tilted slightly toward the sound of his father's voice. "You see, son," Desmond said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy, "I really did not want it to come to this. I wanted us to celebrate tonight. I wanted to stand beside you as a proud father and share in your massive success, but your mother is making this unnecessarily difficult. She is being stubborn. She would rather see your beautiful painting rot in a police basement than share a single dime with the man who gave you life. Do not you dare blame this on me! I shouted, my voice cracking under the immense pressure. You are the one holding his future hostage. You are the one extorting your own child. Desmond completely ignored me. He kept his eyes locked on Jamal, playing the ultimate psychological game. Tell her to be reasonable, Jamal. Tell her to sign the settlement agreement so we can all walk away happy. You do not want to lose your painting, do you? You do not want your big debut to end with a police raid and a massive public scandal. I watched Jamal's face closely. His jaw was locked tight. His knuckles were bone white around the grip of his white cane. He was trapped in a nightmare created by the man who was supposed to protect him. Richard Sterling opened his briefcase again and pulled out a single sheet of paper along with an expensive silver pen. He placed the paper on a nearby cocktail table. This is a standard settlement agreement, Richard explained, tapping the paper with the tip of his pen. It acknowledges my client's 50% ownership stake and authorizes the gallery to split the auction funds directly. You sign this right now, Nia, and the injunction goes straight into the shredder. The auction proceeds as planned. The buyer gets the painting. Jamal gets his $500,000, and his promising career remains completely untarnished. It is a very simple choice. A simple choice. It felt like choosing which arm to cut off. If I signed it, I was rewarding the monster who had abandoned us. I was letting him profit off my son's trauma and my years of backbreaking labor. But if I refused, I would be destroying Jamal's career before it even started. I would be the reason his masterpiece was locked away in a dark basement. The heavy, oppressive silence in the gallery was suddenly broken by the sound of someone clearing their throat. It was a sharp, authoritative sound that instantly commanded the attention of every single person in the room. The anonymous buyer stepped forward from the shadows of the VIP section. He was an older white gentleman with striking silver hair and a sharply tailored charcoal suit. He walked with a silver-handled walking cane, his face set in an expression of severe displeasure. Up until this moment, he had been a silent observer, watching the family drama unfold with cold detachment. But now he was stepping directly into the line of fire. "Excuse me," the buyer said, his deep voice echoing across the hardwood floors. "I believe I have heard quite enough of this domestic dispute." Andre immediately tried to manage the situation, stepping into his professional curator role. "Sir, I apologize profoundly for this disruption. We will have this matter resolved momentarily. Please assure yourself that the gallery stands completely behind the authenticity and title of the artwork." The buyer held up a hand, silencing Andre instantly. "I am not concerned with the authenticity of the art. I am concerned with the legality of the transaction. I am a businessman. I invest in clean, clear assets. I do not invest in liabilities, and right now that painting is a massive, screaming liability." He pointed his silver cane directly at the artwork. "I bid $1 million tonight because I believed I was purchasing a masterpiece with a clean title. I believed I was funding a young disabled prodigy. I did not bid $1 million to buy myself a front row seat to a vicious legal battle between a bitter estranged couple." I felt a cold sweat break out across the back of my neck. "Please, sir," I pleaded, taking a step toward him. "My son worked for 8 months on that painting. It is his entire life. Please do not back out now." The buyer looked at me, his expression softening just a fraction, but his eyes remaining hard and uncompromising. "I sympathize with your situation, Mom. I truly do. It is clear to anyone with eyes that your ex-husband is pulling a rather despicable extortion scheme." Desmond scoffed loudly, opening his mouth to protest, but the buyer shot him a look so intensely cold that Desmond immediately snapped his mouth shut. However, the buyer continued, turning his attention back to me. "My sympathy does not override my business sense. If I write a check for $1 million tonight and that lawyer files an injunction tomorrow morning, my money is tied up in escrow while the artwork is seized by the police. I will not allow my funds to be held hostage by a family feud." I will not have my name dragged through the mud in the local tabloids as the wealthy collector who bought stolen art from a blind teenager. He paused, letting the absolute finality of his words sink into the heavy air of the gallery. You have exactly 2 minutes to resolve this, the buyer announced, looking at his expensive wristwatch. If that settlement agreement is not signed, and this legal threat is not completely neutralized within 120 seconds, I am withdrawing my bid entirely. I will walk out those doors and I will never do business with this gallery again. The ultimatum hit the room like a physical shockwave. The wealthy patrons started murmuring nervously. Several people actually checked their own watches. The tension was completely suffocating. The buyer had just drawn a hard line in the sand, and he was standing firmly on the other side of it. Desmond let out a sharp, triumphant laugh. He rubbed his hands together, looking at me with pure, unadulterated malice. Well, Nia, you heard the man. 2 minutes. The clock is officially ticking. Chloe stepped up beside Desmond, her face glowing with greedy excitement. You better hurry up, Nia, she sneered, pointing a long acrylic fingernail at the settlement paper resting on the cocktail table. You do not want to be the reason your precious little boy loses $1 million, do you? You have to be a good, strong mother and make the sacrifice. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table and tear the paper to shreds. The psychological manipulation was perfectly executed. They were using my love for my son as a weapon against me. They knew I would never let Jamal suffer. They knew I would absorb all the pain and all the humiliation to protect him. Richard Sterling tapped the expensive silver pen against the glass top of the cocktail table. 1 minute and 30 seconds, Mom. I suggest you stop stalling and sign the document. The longer you wait, the closer we get to a complete disaster. I looked around the room. I saw the wealthy elite of Atlanta watching me with a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. I saw Andre standing nearby, his shoulders slumped in defeat, realizing that his power as a gallery owner was completely useless against a legally binding threat. I saw Desmond and Chloe standing together looking like the monsters they truly were, waiting eagerly for their massive payday. And then I looked at Jamal. My beautiful blind son was standing perfectly still next to his masterpiece. His face was completely expressionless, but I could see the slight tremor in his jaw. I could see the way his knuckles gripped his white cane. He had spent his entire life in the dark relying on me to guide him, protecting him from the sharp edges of the world. He had poured his trauma into that canvas, turning his pain into something incredibly valuable, and now that value was being stolen right out from under him. I could not let them take his moment. I could not let them take his future, even if it meant rewarding the devil himself. I took a deep, shaky breath, feeling the armor of the strong black woman settling heavily onto my shoulders. I locked away my rage. I buried my pride. I stepped toward the cocktail table, reaching my hand out toward the silver pen. The walls had completely closed in on us, and there was nowhere left to run. My fingertips hovered just an inch above the cool metal of the pen. The silver surface reflected the bright gallery track lights, mocking my absolute helplessness. My hand was shaking uncontrollably. I hated myself for showing any sign of weakness in front of these monsters, but the physical and emotional toll of this sudden extortion was breaking me down completely. I paused and looked over my shoulder at Jamal. My sweet, brilliant boy had retreated deep into himself. His broad shoulders were hunched forward, defensive and defeated. The knuckles of his right hand were stark white against the grip of his mobility cane. He was tapping his index finger rapidly against the aluminum shaft. It was a nervous habit he had developed right after the devastating car crash. It was a desperate coping mechanism for when the darkness became too overwhelming and his anxiety spiked. Seeing him regress to that state of sheer panic shattered my heart into a million irreparable pieces. I was tired. God, I was so incredibly tired. The immense societal weight of always having to be the strong one was crushing the breath right out of my lungs. Black women are always expected to be the impenetrable shield for our families. We are expected to take the vicious hits, absorb the generational trauma, carry the heavy financial burdens, and never ever let the armor crack. We are told to pray about our pain, endure the disrespect, and rise above the cruelty. For 5 long, agonizing years, I had worn that heavy iron armor every single day. I had aggressively fought the mortgage banks, the relentless hospital billing departments, the stingy insurance companies, and the crushing, suffocating loneliness of single motherhood. But right now, standing in this opulent room full of privileged people who had never missed a meal or faced eviction in their entire lives, I felt my armor finally shattering into fine dust. My mind raced through the terrifying alternatives. If I chose to fight Desmond in civil court, I would have to put Jamal on the witness stand. I would have to force my newly 18-year-old blind son to testify under oath against his own biological father. I would have to subject his fragile mental state to Richard Sterling's ruthless, degrading cross-examination. They would drag all of Jamal's deepest trauma into the permanent public record. They would lock away his masterpiece Brilliant Darkness in a damp, dirty county evidence locker, letting the expensive clay crumble and the vibrant paint peel away. The anonymous buyer would withdraw his massive offer tonight. The $1 million would vanish into thin air. Jamal would lose his spectacular artistic debut, and his creative spirit would be permanently broken before his career even started. I could not let that happen. The price of my pride was simply too high to pay. I pulled my shaking hand back from the hovering silver pen. I am not signing anything without speaking to my legal counsel first. I stated, my voice sounding hollow and heavily defeated. Richard Sterling checked his expensive silver wristwatch, tapping the glass face with his index finger. You have exactly 60 seconds remaining, ma'am. I pulled my phone from my designer purse and hit the emergency speed dial for my attorney. Her name was Evelyn, and she was a fierce, brilliant lawyer who had helped me fight the terrifying foreclosure on my house years ago. The phone rang twice before she answered. Her voice was sharp, clear, and entirely professional even at this late evening hour. Evelyn, I need you to draft a financial release right now, I said, speaking rapidly and breathlessly into the receiver. I am at Andre's art gallery downtown. Desmond is here. Desmond, your ex-husband. Evelyn asked, her tone instantly shifting from calm to high alert. Nia, what on earth is going on? I thought tonight was Jamal's big charity auction. It is. I swallowed hard, fighting desperately back a rising sob. A private buyer just bid $1 million for the painting. But Desmond suddenly showed up with a predatory lawyer. He has a written contract, Evelyn. He tricked Jamal into signing a creative representation agreement 6 months ago. They are threatening to file an immediate ex parte injunction to seize the artwork tomorrow morning if I do not give them half the auction proceeds right now. The buyer is threatening to walk away entirely. We have less than a minute to decide. Nia, do not sign a single thing, Evelyn commanded, her voice radiating pure, righteous legal fury. Let them file the damn injunction. We will fight this ridiculous extortion in court. The contract was signed by a minor under completely false pretenses. It is a predatory, unconscionable agreement. I can absolutely get it thrown out by a judge. How long will that take? I asked, my voice cracking under the intense pressure. How long will the painting be locked away in police evidence? Evelyn hesitated. The heavy silence on the other end of the line was the only devastating answer I needed. The civil dockets in Fulton County are severely backed up right now. Nia, she finally admitted, her voice dropping softly. It could easily take 6 to 8 months just to get a preliminary evidentiary hearing. Maybe a full year or more for a complete trial. I closed my eyes tightly. A single warm tear slipped down my cheek, betraying my stoic facade. I quickly wiped it away, furious at myself for crying in front of Desmond and his smug mistress. A year. Jamal would lose the wealthy buyer tonight. The gallery would lose its elite credibility. The powerful momentum of my son's entire artistic career would be completely destroyed by a messy, embarrassing public scandal. I cannot let him lose this moment. Evelyn, I whispered into the phone, shielding my mouth with my hand. He worked too hard. He suffered way too much in the dark. I will not let his deadbeat father ruin this beautiful night for him. Call the gallery financial office. Tell them to authorize the split. Prepare the final settlement documents immediately. Nia, please think about this carefully, Evelyn pleaded, genuine concern bleeding through the phone line. You are letting the bad guy win. You are handing a heartless monster $500,000 of your disabled son's hard-earned money. I am not losing. I am buying my son's absolute freedom. I corrected her, my voice hardening with a grim, unbreakable resolve. I am paying a hostage ransom. Just do it, Evelyn. Please do it now. I ended the call abruptly before she could argue any further. The dial tone echoed sharply in my ear, sounding exactly like the final heavy nail being driven into the coffin of my pride. I slowly lowered the phone, slipped it back into my purse, and turned back to face the hostile room. The anonymous buyer was watching me intently, holding his silver-handled cane, his distinguished face completely unreadable. Andre was staring intensely at the floor, his massive hands balled into tight fists of completely helpless rage. The wealthy gallery patrons had gone completely silent, holding their collective breath, waiting anxiously for the final verdict of this agonizing public family drama. And then there was Desmond. He was standing with his arms crossed arrogantly over his chest, leaning back comfortably on his heels, with a sickening, triumphant smile plastered across his face. Chloe was practically bouncing on her toes, her greedy eyes fixed entirely on the settlement paper resting on the glass table. I looked directly at Andre. My strong, protective brother-in-law slowly raised his eyes to meet mine. I could clearly see the profound sorrow and understanding in his deep brown gaze. He knew exactly what I was about to do. Let him take it, I said, my voice breaking just a fraction on the first word before I forced it back into a steady, commanding rhythm. Authorize the legal transfer, Andre. Give them the money. Andre closed his eyes tightly and nodded slowly, a painful gesture of absolute defeat. I turned my attention to the anonymous buyer. The family dispute is completely settled, sir. You have your clear, undisputed title. The artwork is fully yours. The buyer gave a curt, respectful nod. A very wise decision, ma'am, he said, though his deep tone carried a heavy weight of pity that made my stomach churn violently. I will immediately inform my private bank to proceed with the wire transaction. Finally, I turned to face Desmond. I walked right up to him, stopping mere inches away from his smug, arrogant face. The overwhelming smell of his expensive cologne, mixed with Chloe's cheap floral perfume, made me want to violently vomit all over his custom-tailored suit. Take the $500,000, Desmond, I said, my voice a harsh, raspy whisper that only he and Chloe could hear clearly. Take the money and never come anywhere near my son ever again. Do not call his phone. Do not visit our house. Do not ever claim to be his loving father to anyone ever again. As of tonight, you are completely dead to us. Desmond let out a low, victorious chuckle, completely unfazed by my intense hatred. He reached out and casually brushed a piece of invisible lint off his suit jacket lapel. Always so incredibly dramatic, Nia. But I graciously accept your terms. A smart businessman always knows when to close a highly profitable deal and walk away. Chloe let out a loud, obnoxious squeal of pure delight. She clapped her hands together, the fake diamond rings on her fingers glittering brightly under the gallery track lights. We are going to Cabo, she announced excitedly, grabbing Desmond's arm and shaking it. I told you this plan was going to work, baby. I told you we were going to get paid tonight. The sheer profound injustice of the moment was entirely suffocating. I had done absolutely everything right in my life. I had worked myself to the bone. I had fiercely protected my disabled child. I had played by all the harsh rules of a society that constantly demanded my endless sacrifice. And yet the absolute villain of the story was winning. The cowardly man who abandoned a critically injured child was walking away with $500,000 while I was left standing there, forced to pick up the shattered pieces of my son's broken heart. Richard Sterling picked up the expensive silver pen and held it out to me with a blank professional expression. Just your signature on the bottom line, Mom, and this highly unpleasant business is officially concluded. I stared down at the silver pen. It felt significantly heavier than a solid lead pipe. Every single muscle in my tired body screamed in loud, aggressive protest. Every fierce maternal instinct I possessed aggressively demanded that I fight back and destroy them. But the looming legal threat of the injunction, The terrifying mental image of armed police officers violently seizing my son's delicate artwork paralyzed my actions completely. I slowly reached out my trembling fingers, deliberately wrapping them around the cold, smooth metal casing of the pen. This was without a doubt my absolute darkest moment. The feeling of profound, undeniable failure washed over me like a massive tidal wave of freezing ice. I had totally failed to protect him from the monster hiding in his past. I had failed to keep his incredible artistic triumph pure and untainted. I was literally signing away half his massive fortune to the very man who broke our family into pieces. I leaned over the glass cocktail table, pressing the sharp tip of the silver pen heavily against the thick watermarked paper. I took a sharp, deep breath, ready to sign my name and completely surrender our hard-earned victory to the darkness. But before the black ink could even touch the white page, the entire energetic rhythm of the room suddenly changed. The sound was sharp and rhythmic, echoing loudly against the exposed brick walls of the gallery. Tap, tap, tap. It was the aluminum tip of Jamal's mobility cane striking the polished hardwood floor. But it was not the frantic, nervous tapping from just a few moments ago. This rhythm was slow, deliberate, and incredibly heavy. It sounded like the steady ticking of a massive clock counting down to an inevitable explosion. I froze my hand, hovering over the settlement agreement, the silver pen trembling between my fingers. I looked up. Jamal was moving. He stepped away from the protective velvet rope guarding his masterpiece. He walked with absolute certainty directly toward the glass cocktail table. He did not stumble. He did not hesitate. He moved with the fluid grace of someone who knew exactly where every single obstacle in the room was located. He reached out his left hand and placed it gently but firmly over mine. His palm was warm, and his grip was astonishingly strong. I looked up into my son's face. The fearful, vulnerable boy who had been shrinking into his own shoulders just seconds ago was completely gone. In his place stood a man. He leaned down slightly, bringing his face close to my ear. "Let me handle this, Mom," he whispered. His voice had dropped a full octave. It was no longer the soft, wavering tone of a teenager overwhelmed by the cruel adult world. It was a deep, resonant baritone vibrating with a quiet, terrifying power. I let go of the silver pen. I stepped back, allowing Jamal to physically place himself between me and the monsters trying to ruin us. The transition was seamless and profoundly moving. For 5 grueling years, I had stood in front of him, shielding him from the relentless blows of our tragic reality. I had fought the bill collectors, the insurance agents, and the crushing pity of society. But in that single breathtaking moment, the roles reversed entirely. My blind son became my absolute protector. Jamal straightened his posture, rolling his broad shoulders back. He stood a full 2 inches taller than his father. He turned his head, perfectly aligning his dark glasses with where Desmond was standing. The gallery went dead silent. The wealthy patrons, the gallery staff, the anonymous buyer, everyone stopped breathing. The energetic frequency of the room shifted from chaotic desperation to a cold, suffocating tension. Desmond reached his hand out impatiently toward the paperwork, clearly eager to finalize his extortion. "What are you doing?" Jamal Desmond asked. His voice tinged with a sudden flicker of nervous irritation. "Your mother is trying to do the right thing. Tell her to finish signing the document so we can all go home and celebrate." Jamal did not move. He tilted his head slightly, analyzing his father's voice like a predator locking onto the heartbeat of its prey. "Celebrate," Jamal repeated the word, rolling off his tongue with dripping, icy sarcasm. "You want to celebrate? You want to take $500,000 from a blind kid you abandoned and then pop a bottle of champagne?" Desmond forced a tight, patronizing laugh, looking around the room for support that simply was not there. "Now, son, you know that is not how it is. This is business. I am your angel investor. We are partners in this incredible journey. You need to understand how the real world operates." Richard Sterling stepped forward, attempting to use his aggressive legal persona to bully Jamal back into submission. "Listen to your father, young man. This injunction is fully prepared. If that paper is not signed immediately, you lose everything. You lose the buyer, you lose the gallery representation, and your artwork gets locked away in a police evidence room. Jamal turned his face slightly toward the lawyer. Are you Richard Sterling? Jamal asked, his voice terrifyingly calm. The lawyer blinked, clearly caught off guard by the boy's absolute composure. Yes, I am. I represent your father. Jamal nodded slowly. Mr. Sterling, you wear a very expensive cologne. Tom Ford Oud Wood, if my sense of smell is correct. It is a powerful, commanding scent, the kind of fragrance a man wears when he wants to intimidate the people around him. But underneath that expensive cologne, I can smell something else. I can smell stale coffee, cheap breath mints, and the distinct sour odor of nervous sweat. You are sweating, Mr. Sterling. Why is a high-powered attorney sweating during a simple contract settlement? Richard Sterling's face turned a deep shade of crimson. He aggressively adjusted his silk tie, his professional composure severely rattling. I am not sweating. I am merely impatient. We are wasting valuable time. Jamal smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was a cold, calculated baring of teeth. You are sweating because you know your client is a liar, Jamal stated, his voice ringing clearly across the silent gallery. You are sweating because you know that filing a fraudulent injunction based on a deceptive contract could get you permanently disbarred in the state of Georgia. Chloe let out a loud, dramatic sigh, rolling her eyes and placing her hands on her hips. Oh my God, she complained loudly. This is absolutely ridiculous. Desmond, tell your blind kid to back off and let the adults handle the grown-up business. I am tired of standing here in these painful high heels. Before Desmond could even open his mouth, Jamal turned his attention directly to her. His precision was uncanny. It was as if he could see every single movement in the room. You must be Chloe, Jamal said, his tone slicing through the air like a freshly sharpened scalpel. The woman who moved into my father's bed while I was lying in a hospital bed with my eyes wrapped in thick surgical gauze. The woman who wants equity in the house my mother broke her back to pay for. Chloe shrank back slightly, her arrogant bravado momentarily faltering under the intense verbal assault. Jamal did not raise his voice. He did not have to. His quiet, absolute authority was far more intimidating than any loud, angry, screaming match. Desmond stepped aggressively in front of Chloe, puffing his chest out in a pathetic display of dominance. Do not speak to her like that, Desmond commanded, pointing a finger at his own son. I am your father. You will treat me and my future wife with respect. Respect, Jamal echoed softly. Respect is a fascinating concept, Desmond. You walked into this gallery tonight demanding respect based entirely on a biological technicality. You claim you are my father. You claim you are my investor. You claim you own 50% of my creative genius. Desmond smiled, his smug arrogance returning in full force. He thought Jamal was finally conceding the argument. Exactly, son. I provided the foundation. I bought the specialized clay, the imported metallic pigments, the expensive structural canvas. My financial investment makes me a legal partner in the creation of brilliant darkness. Therefore, I am entitled to half the profits. It is basic economics. You should be thanking me for having the incredible vision to support your little hobby. Jamal reached down and picked up the expensive silver pen from the glass cocktail table. He rolled the smooth metal between his thumb and forefinger, feeling its heavy weight. He did not look like a victim being extorted. He looked like a master chess player who had just forced his opponent into a devastating, unavoidable checkmate. Vision, Jamal said slowly, repeating the word as if tasting it. You talk about having vision. You look at me, and you see a blind, helpless teenager who needs his daddy to navigate the business world. You look at my mother, and you see a desperate woman you can easily bully into writing a massive check. You look at this magnificent gallery, and you see nothing but a giant cash register. But your vision is completely flawed, Desmond. You only see what you want to see. You never bothered to look closely at the fine print. Richard Sterling cleared his throat nervously, stepping forward again. We are not here to debate philosophy, young man. The legal contract is signed. The terms are incredibly clear. You either sign this settlement agreement right now, or the injunction gets filed tonight. Those are your only two options. Jamal turned his head toward the lawyer, his dark glasses reflecting the bright gallery lights. Are you absolutely sure about that? Mr. Sterling, Jamal asked, his voice dropping even lower. Because as a professional attorney, you should know better than anyone that relying on a fraudulent document is a very dangerous game to play. I assure you the contract is legally binding. Richard Sterling shot back, his confidence wavering just a fraction. We have your verified signature on the document. Jamal let out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed through the high-ceilinged room. My signature. Right. Let us talk about that highly valuable signature. Jamal took a slow, deliberate step toward Desmond. He held the silver pen up, holding it casually between his fingers like a tiny silver weapon. Just to be absolutely clear, Jamal said, his voice projecting loud enough for the anonymous buyer Andre and every single wealthy patron to hear perfectly. You are stating for the public record in front of dozens of credible witnesses that you explicitly provided the physical materials embedded in the center of that painting. Desmond looked around the room, his greedy eyes locking onto the anonymous buyer who was still holding his silver walking cane waiting for the resolution. Desmond wanted to ensure the millionaire knew exactly who was responsible for the masterpiece. He wanted to claim all the credit for my son's agonizing hard work. Yes, Desmond declared, his voice loud and incredibly boastful. I absolutely provided those materials. I went to the specialty art store. I picked out the specific textures you asked for. I paid for them using my own hard-earned money. I am the sole reason that painting exists tonight. Jamal stopped rolling the pen. He held it perfectly still. He smiled again, and this time it was a smile of pure lethal victory. My son had just perfectly set the trap. He had systematically eliminated every single exit route. He had manipulated a master manipulator. By forcing Desmond to proudly claim ownership of the physical materials in front of a gallery full of elite witnesses, Jamal had locked his father into a legal bind that Desmond could not even begin to comprehend. The dynamic in the room had completely flipped. Desmond was no longer the powerful predator holding our family hostage. He was a blind fool walking happily straight off a massive cliff. And my incredible, resilient son was the one who had meticulously drawn the map. Jamal turned his head slightly toward Richard Sterling. You see, Mr. Sterling, when you lose one of your primary senses, your brain rewires itself to compensate. My eyes no longer process light or color, but my remaining senses have become incredibly sharp. I do not just hear sounds, I feel their exact vibrations. I do not just feel textures, I can read the microscopic variations in a surface. And my sense of smell is highly attuned to my environment. My father thought he was dealing with a helpless disabled victim that Tuesday afternoon. He thought my blindness made me stupid. Desmond scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. You signed the paper, Jamal. All the heightened senses in the world do not change the ink on that page. Jamal ignored the interruption, keeping his focus entirely directed at the lawyer. When he handed me that piece of paper 6 months ago, he told me it was a standard delivery receipt for an expensive package of art supplies. He placed it on our kitchen island. He guided my hand to the bottom of the page. He expected me to just blindly obey. But the moment he set that paper down, my senses told me a completely different story. I watched Jamal with absolute awe. The gallery patrons were practically leaning forward, straining to catch every single word my son was speaking. The wealthy collectors had completely forgotten about the champagne and the auction. They were captivated by this incredible young man, systematically dismantling a professional extortionist. First of all, Jamal continued, his voice smooth and methodical. It was the paper itself. A standard courier delivery receipt is printed on thin, cheap carbon copy paper or thermal receipt paper. It has a very distinct flimsy texture that crinkles softly under the slightest pressure. But the document my father slid across the cold granite countertop was completely different. It was heavy and stiff. It was printed on thick 24-pound legal bond paper. I could easily feel the sharp, rigid edges and the heavy woven grain under my sensitive fingertips. It was the exact kind of high-quality premium paper my mother uses every single day for her official real estate appraisal contracts. It did not feel like a receipt. It felt exactly like a formal binding legal agreement. Richard Sterling shifted his weight uncomfortably, suddenly looking very out of place in the upscale environment. He adjusted his tight grip on his heavy leather briefcase, his knuckles turning slightly pale. He quickly glanced sideways at Desmond. A brief, undeniable flicker of serious professional concern finally broke through his previously impenetrable, icy exterior. The lawyer was starting to realize that his supposedly foolproof case was built entirely on a foundation of lies. But the paperweight was not the most obvious clue, Jamal said, taking another step forward. It was the smell. A package that has been riding around in the back of a delivery truck all day, smells like exhaust fumes, cardboard, and hot asphalt. A standard delivery receipt smells like cheap industrial ink. But the paper my father put in front of me smelled entirely different. It smelled like warm ozone and fresh laser printer toner. It smelled exactly like a document that had just been printed at the FedEx office down the street less than 10 minutes ago. My heart swelled with an immense, indescribable pride. My son was brilliant. He had noticed every single discrepancy. He had perceived the entire trap while standing in total darkness. I knew instantly that he was lying. Jamal stated, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. I knew the man who abandoned my mother and me, when I was fighting for my life, had not suddenly returned just to bring me a birthday present. I knew he was trying to steal from me. Desmond let out a loud, exasperated sigh, clearly tired of the dramatic storytelling. This is all very fascinating, son. You have a great nose. Congratulations. But you still put the pen to the paper. You still signed the legally binding contract. You knew it was a contract and you signed it anyway. That makes it valid. You just admitted to signing it intentionally. Jamal smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver straight down my spine. Yes, I knew it was a contract. And yes, I intentionally signed it. But I did not sign it with my legal signature. The gallery went completely dead silent. I looked over at Andre, who suddenly let out a low, booming chuckle of pure, absolute delight. My brother-in-law crossed his massive arms over his chest, looking incredibly pleased with himself. What are you talking about? Desmond snapped, his arrogant facade finally showing a massive crack. I am looking right at your signature. It is your name. Jamal turned toward Andre. Uncle Andre, would you please explain the legal structure we established on my 16th birthday? Andre stepped forward, his presence commanding the entire room. He looked directly at Richard Sterling, speaking clearly and professionally as one businessman to another. 2 years ago, when Jamal's artwork first began gaining serious attention in the local community, I knew we had to protect his intellectual property. I knew there were vultures out there who would try to exploit a young visually impaired artist. So Nia and I hired a top-tier entertainment lawyer. We established an incredibly strict, irrevocable trust to manage all of Jamal's creative assets and financial earnings. Richard Sterling swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing noticeably above his expensive silk tie. An irrevocable trust. He repeated, his voice losing its previous arrogant edge. Exactly. Andre confirmed, smiling coldly. Every single piece of art Jamal creates, every penny he earns from a sale belongs entirely to the trust. He is the sole beneficiary, but the trust itself holds the legal rights to his artistic portfolio. Desmond looked frantically back and forth between Andre and the lawyer. I do not care about a trust, he yelled, his voice rising in panic. I have a contract signed by the artist himself. It grants me 50% equity. Jamal raised his hand, silencing his father instantly. The trust has incredibly specific bylaws, Desmond. Because I am visually impaired and cannot visually verify the contents of a printed document, we built in a highly specialized fail-safe mechanism. A mechanism designed specifically to prevent predatory individuals from tricking me into signing away my life. Jamal reached into the inner pocket of his tailored charcoal suit jacket. He pulled out a small, heavy brass object and held it up for the entire room to see. It was a custom-made embosser, a heavy metal stamp used for pressing raised seals into paper. According to the legally binding terms of my irrevocable trust, Jamal explained, his voice echoing with absolute authority, my standard handwritten signature holds zero legal weight on any document pertaining to my art or my finances. My handwritten signature is considered purely decorative. It is my artistic signature. For any legal contract, representation agreement, or financial document to be considered valid and binding in the state of Georgia, it must bear my handwritten signature, and it must be physically stamped with this exact raised wax seal. The collective gasp from the gallery crowd was incredibly loud. I felt a massive weight lift completely off my shoulders. The crushing, suffocating anxiety evaporated into thin air. My son had not been trapped. He had outsmarted them all. If the document does not have the specific physical indentation stamped into the paper, Jamal continued pressing his thumb against the metal plate of the embosser, then the signature is completely void. It is a worthless piece of paper. Richard Sterling snatched the crisp contract directly out of Desmond's hands. He held the white document high up into the bright, intense glare of the gallery track lighting. He ran his index and middle fingers frantically over the bottom edge of the page, pressing his thumb aggressively against the black ink of the signature line. He flipped the paper over rapidly, checking the backside for any subtle indentations. He was desperately searching for the familiar raised bumps of an official notary or trust seal. He pressed his fingers against the paper again and again, hoping to feel even the slightest texture. He found absolutely nothing. The high-quality paper was completely smooth from edge to edge. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. Desmond watched his lawyer with wide, terrified eyes. Richard Desmond asked, his voice trembling slightly. "What is he talking about? Tell me the contract is good. Tell me we have the legal right to the money." Richard Sterling slowly lowered the document. His face had turned a sickly shade of pale gray. He looked at Jamal with a mixture of absolute horror and profound professional respect. The slick, aggressive attorney who had threatened to destroy our lives just minutes ago was now physically sweating. A bead of perspiration rolled slowly down his forehead. "Is it true?" Richard Sterling asked, his voice dropping to barely a hoarse whisper. He was no longer looking at Desmond. He was staring directly at Andre, recognizing the gallery owner as the true architect of this legal fortress. "Is the trust properly registered with the state of Georgia? Are the specific signature bylaws fully documented in the official legal filings?" Andre nodded, pulling his phone from his pocket. "Fully registered and legally bulletproof, Mr. Sterling. I can pull up the official state registry right now. The bylaws clearly state that any contract lacking the physical embossed seal is immediately null and void. Your client tricked a blind boy into signing a piece of paper, but that paper holds absolutely no legal authority over his creative assets." "You played me," Jamal said, turning his face back toward his father. "You thought you could walk into my home, hand me a printed piece of garbage, and steal my entire future. You thought my blindness was a weakness you could exploit. But you were the blind one, Desmond. You were so blinded by your own greed that you never considered I might actually be smarter than you." Desmond grabbed the paper out of the lawyer's hands, staring at it furiously, as if sheer willpower could magically make the seal appear. "No," he shouted, crumpling the edge of the contract in his fist. "This is a trick. This is some kind of elaborate scam you and your mother cooked up to cut me out of my rightful share." "It is not a scam, Desmond," I said, finally stepping forward, my voice ringing with absolute triumph. "It is the law, the same law you just tried to use as a weapon against us. You thought you had us trapped. You thought you could extort $500,000 from your own son, but all you have is a worthless piece of paper printed at a local copy shop." Chloe, who had been standing quietly in the background, suddenly realized that her massive promised payday was rapidly disappearing right in front of her greedy eyes. She marched aggressively forward, her fake designer high heels stomping loudly against the polished hardwood floor. "This is absolutely ridiculous!" she shrieked at the top of her lungs, pointing a long, brightly painted acrylic fingernail directly at Jamal. "You cannot just invent fake secret rules to get out of a legally signed contract. We are taking you straight to court. We will sue you for every single penny you have ever made. We will drag this incredibly stupid fight out for years if we have to. We are not leaving here empty-handed tonight." Richard Sterling quickly reached out and grabbed Chloe's arm, pulling her back sharply. "Shut up," he hissed through clenched teeth. "Just shut your mouth right now." Chloe looked at the lawyer in absolute shock. "Excuse me?" she demanded, yanking her arm away. "You work for us. I am trying to keep you out of prison." Richard Sterling snapped, his professional demeanor completely unraveling. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "If what they are saying about the irrevocable trust is true, and I am absolutely certain it is, then this contract is not just void. It is documentary evidence of attempted criminal fraud. The word fraud hung heavily in the air. Desmond's face dropped entirely. The arrogant, smug expression he had worn since walking through the gallery doors melted away, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. "You walked into this gallery." Richard Sterling continued, his voice trembling with anger, directing his fury entirely at his own client. "You told me you had a legitimate business partnership with your son. You explicitly told me this contract was signed in good faith. You lied to me, Desmond. You used me to attempt an illegal extortion scheme against a heavily protected trust fund." "I did not lie," Desmond stammered, taking a step backward away from his own attorney. "I am his father. I bought the supplies. I provided the materials for the artwork. I am entitled to compensation." Jamal tapped his cane sharply against the floor, instantly cutting off his father's pathetic excuses. "You are right about one thing, Desmond. You did provide the materials. You stood in front of this entire room and loudly claimed ownership of the physical elements embedded in my painting." Jamal smiled again, a cold, terrifying expression. "And that is exactly where you made your fatal mistake." Desmond stared at Jamal, completely bewildered. The confidence that had previously inflated his chest deflated, leaving him looking hollow and desperate. A fatal mistake. He repeated the words slowly, as if trying to decipher a foreign language. He looked at his lawyer, expecting Richard Sterling to swoop in and aggressively neutralize the threat. But Richard was taking slow, deliberate steps backward. The slick attorney was distancing himself from his own client, trying to sever the toxic association before the legal explosion caught him in the blast radius. Desmond realized he was suddenly standing completely alone. The massive fortune he had practically tasted was rapidly vaporizing into thin air. He felt the burning gaze of the gallery patrons bearing down on him. They were no longer looking at him like an adversary. They looked at him like a trapped rat. Chloe grabbed Desmond by the sleeve of his expensive suit, her long acrylic nails digging sharply into the fabric. "Do something," she hissed, her voice shrill and trembling with unadulterated greed. "Do not just stand there looking stupid, Desmond. Make them pay us. You promised me we were leaving here rich tonight." Desmond violently yanked his arm away from her grasp, his face contorting into an ugly mask of pure desperation. He was a narcissist entirely cornered by his own hubris. When a narcissist is stripped of their power, they do not gracefully surrender. They double down. They lash out blindly, hoping to cause collateral damage to force a hasty compromise. Desmond wiped a bead of sweat from his upper lip and aggressively turned his attention back to the massive textured canvas hanging on the gallery wall. He pointed a trembling finger directly at brilliant darkness. "Fine," Desmond yelled, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure. "You want to play legal games with the trust fund bylaws? Go ahead. The contract for the intellectual property might be void, but you cannot deny the absolute physical reality standing right in front of you." He marched right up to the velvet stanchion, completely ignoring Andre's warning glare. He aggressively gestured toward the intricate layers of the artwork. "This painting is not just made of thin air and good intentions," Desmond shouted, turning to face the wealthy crowd. "It is built from physical, tangible assets, expensive imported clay, industrial-grade acrylic bonding agents, shattered tempered glass, metallic structural mesh. I provided every single ounce of that material. I handed that box directly to him. I financed the actual physical construction of this piece. Therefore, I maintain a legal, equitable interest in the raw materials themselves." The absolute absurdity of his argument sent a ripple of disgusted murmurs through the elite crowd. He was literally trying to claim ownership of the dirt and crushed glass glued to a canvas. It was the most pathetic display of greedy desperation I had ever witnessed in my entire life. But unfortunately, in the rigid technicalities of property law, a physical contribution could potentially create a valid legal lien. Desmond locked his wild, desperate eyes onto the anonymous buyer. The distinguished older gentleman was still holding his silver walking cane, watching the chaotic scene unfold with a look of absolute severe distaste. "You, sir!" Desmond yelled, pointing directly at the millionaire. "You bid $1 million for this piece. but you cannot legally take possession of it until the physical title is completely cleared. You are buying stolen property. I demand immediate compensation for the raw materials I provided. If I do not get a check tonight, I will report this gallery for trafficking stolen goods. I will tie this physical object up in small claims court for the next 5 years. I will make sure nobody ever gets to enjoy it. I felt my stomach drop violently. Desmond was acting like a cornered animal threatening to destroy the beautiful masterpiece simply because he could not profit from it. He was willing to burn Jamal's entire career to the ground out of pure spite. Andre stepped forward, ready to physically throw Desmond out of the building, but Jamal reached out his strong hand and gripped Andre's shoulder firmly, stopping the massive gallery owner in his tracks. "Let him talk," Jamal said, his deep voice carrying effortlessly over Desmond's frantic shouting. "Let him claim it." I looked into the crowd and noticed several wealthy patrons holding up their smartphones. The little red recording lights were glowing brightly in the dim gallery illumination. Desmond was so blinded by his frantic rage and insatiable greed that he did not even realize he was performing for an active audience. He was permanently documenting his own catastrophic downfall. "Are you absolutely sure you want to make this claim?" Desmond Jamal asked, stepping closer to the velvet rope. "You are stating unequivocally right here, right now, that you bought the specific materials embedded in the exact center of this canvas." "Yes," Desmond screamed, his face turning a dark, violent shade of purple. "I bought the glass. I bought the metal. I own the physical core of that painting. It belongs to me. You are all witnesses. I am the sole owner of the physical elements used to construct this artwork, and I demand my rightful financial compensation immediately." Richard Sterling took another large step backward, bumping directly into a tall cocktail table. The lawyer looked physically ill. He recognized the tone in Jamal's voice. It was the exact same tone a seasoned prosecutor uses when cross-examining a hostile witness who is cheerfully committing blatant perjury. The lawyer desperately wanted to intervene, to shout at his client to stop talking immediately, but Richard Sterling was completely paralyzed by the sheer unprecedented magnitude of the unfolding disaster. He simply stood there watching the train wreck happen in real time. Desmond, however, felt completely invigorated by his own aggressive shouting. He thought he had successfully pivoted his legal strategy. He thought he had discovered a brilliant, indestructible loophole. He puffed his chest out, adjusting his silk pocket square with a shaky hand. He glared at me with a look of pure, unadulterated venom. "You thought you were so smart?" Nia Desmond sneered, his voice echoing sharply across the hardwood floors. "You thought you could hide his money in a fancy trust fund. You thought you could use technicalities to cut me out of the deal. But you forgot one basic universal rule of business. He who owns the supply chain controls the final product." I gave him the box. I handed him the building blocks. Without my generous contribution, this $1 million painting would literally not exist. It would just be a blank piece of useless white canvas. So you can take your embossed wax seals and your fancy trust fund bylaws and you can throw them right in the garbage. Because until you pay me for the raw materials, this transaction is completely frozen. I am placing a verbal lien on the physical assets right here and right now. The gallery patrons began shifting uncomfortably. A few people actually started whispering to each other, questioning the legal validity of his outrageous claim. Could a person actually halt $1 million art auction over a few $100s worth of clay and broken glass? It sounded completely insane, but the aggressive confidence radiating from Desmond made people second-guess the situation. Chloe, noticing the slight hesitation in the crowd, immediately jumped back into the fray. She crossed her arms over her cheap designer dress and nodded vigorously. "That is exactly right," she chimed in, her voice dripping with extreme arrogance. "We have receipts for those materials. We have bank statements proving we bought them. You people think you are so much better than us just because you wear expensive clothes and drink free champagne. But the law applies to everyone equally. Pay us for the materials, or we take the painting." I stared at the two of them, feeling a strange mixture of intense disgust and profound pity. They were completely oblivious to the massive steel trap hovering right above their heads. They thought they were holding us hostage, but they were actually eagerly tying the rope around their own necks. I looked over at Jamal. My son was standing perfectly still, his dark glasses reflecting the ambient light of the room. His posture was completely relaxed. He was not gripping his white cane tightly anymore. He was simply letting it rest lightly against the floor. He had completely absorbed their vitriolic attacks and allowed their blinding arrogance to reach its absolute peak. He let the heavy, tense silence hang in the air for a few agonizing seconds, letting Desmond's aggressive claims settle deeply into the minds of every single witness in the room. He wanted absolute confirmation on the public record. This was exactly what Jamal had planned for perfectly. Jamal tilted his head slightly, letting the faint echo of their threats fade completely away. He was now fully ready to execute his final move. A slow, chilling smile spread across Jamal's face. It was not a smile of joy, but a cold, calculated expression of absolute predatory control. He took one step closer to his father, closing the distance between them. "I just want to be absolutely certain." Desmond Jamal said, his voice dropping into a deadly quiet register that forced the entire room to lean in just to hear him. "You are stating on the record in front of the gallery owner, the buyer, and every single patron in this room that you are the sole owner of the physical materials embedded directly in the center of my painting." Desmond threw his hands up in the air, completely exasperated by what he thought was his son's desperate stalling tactic. "Yes," Desmond shouted at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing harshly off the brick walls. "For the absolute last time, yes. I bought the materials. I own the materials. I am legally entitled to compensation for every single piece of glass and metal glued to that canvas. Now cut the dramatic nonsense and tell your mother to write the check." Jamal nodded slowly. He lifted his white mobility cane from the floor. With an astonishing level of spatial precision, he extended the aluminum shaft forward. He did not point it vaguely at the canvas. He guided the tip of the cane directly toward the exact geometric center of the massive artwork, stopping just a fraction of an inch away from the highly textured surface. The gallery track lighting caught the silver tip of the cane, illuminating the specific cluster of dark shattered glass embedded deep within the painted clay. "Have any of you wondered why this painting is titled Brilliant Darkness?" Jamal asked, addressing the silent room without turning his head. Art critics have written extensive reviews claiming it represents the abstract struggle of living without sight. They say it symbolizes the chaotic emotional journey of navigating a world permanently shrouded in shadow. But the truth is entirely literal. This painting is not an abstract metaphor. It is a highly detailed physical map. It is a precise tactile recreation of the exact moment my entire world went completely black. The heavy silence in the gallery deepened, becoming almost suffocating. The wealthy patrons stopped shifting on their feet. The champagne glasses were lowered. Even Chloe stopped fidgeting with her cheap designer dress, sensing the terrifying shift in the atmosphere. 5 years ago, my father came home and told my mother that his prized luxury vehicle had been stolen right out of our suburban driveway. Jamal continued, his voice echoing clearly and steadily. He filed an official police report. He filed a massive insurance claim. 2 nights later, I was riding in the passenger seat of my uncle's car. We were driving through an intersection late at night. My father claimed we were hit by an anonymous drunk driver who ran a red light and fled the scene. The impact was absolutely catastrophic. The passenger side of our vehicle was completely crushed. The shattered glass from the windshield shredded my face. The immense blunt force trauma severed my optic nerves, permanently destroying my vision. I felt a cold tear slip down my cheek. I remembered that horrific night with sickening clarity. I remembered the screaming ambulance sirens, the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room, and the agonizing moment the surgeon told me my sweet, innocent boy would never see the sun again. My father played the role of the grieving, traumatized parent perfectly, Jamal said, stepping slightly to the side, allowing the crowd a clearer view of the canvas center. He stood by my hospital bed, crying heavily. He blamed the criminal who supposedly stole his car. He blamed the anonymous drunk driver. And then a few weeks later, he took the massive insurance payout, packed his bags, and abandoned us to start a brand new wealthy life with his mistress. He thought he had successfully buried his dirty secrets in the twisted metal of that violent car crash. Jamal lowered his cane and reached his hand out. He traced his index finger gently over the sharp, jagged pieces of glass embedded in the center of the painting. But he forgot one crucial detail. Jamal whispered, the sound carrying a heavy, devastating weight. He forgot that when the paramedics were desperately using the heavy machinery to rip the crushed car door open, I was awake. I was trapped in the mangled passenger seat, bleeding heavily from my eyes, completely blinded by the trauma. I reached my hands out frantically in the dark, trying to find something to hold on to, trying to find a way out of the crushing metal. My bleeding fingers brushed against the dashboard of the car that had struck us, and I found something resting in the shattered debris. I closed my fist around it. I held onto it tightly while they pulled my broken body from the wreckage. I hid it in my pocket. I kept it completely hidden for 5 long, agonizing years. Desmond was staring at Jamal, his mouth slightly open, his breath hitching audibly in his throat. The arrogant color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a pale, terrified ghost. Richard Sterling was frozen completely rigid, refusing to even look at his own client. "What did you find?" Desmond whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. Jamal turned his head toward his father, fixing his dark glasses squarely on Desmond's terrified face. "I found the faceplate of a custom-engraved luxury Rolex watch," Jamal stated, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "The exact same heavy gold Rolex watch you bragged about buying just 3 days before the crash. The watch that magically disappeared the same night your car was supposedly stolen. The watch you claimed was in the glove compartment when the imaginary car thieves drove away." The gallery crowd gasped collectively. A wave of horrified murmurs rippled through the elite audience as the terrifying pieces of the puzzle rapidly snapped together. The drunk driver was not anonymous. The car had never been stolen. Desmond had been driving the vehicle that nearly killed his own son. He had fled the scene of a catastrophic accident, committed massive insurance fraud, and left his injured child to go permanently blind in the dark. "And do you know what I did with that shattered piece of custom-engraved glass?" Jamal asked, his voice rising in intensity, filling every single corner of the massive room. "I saved it. I waited. I knew if I handed it to the police as a traumatized blind teenager, you would just hire an expensive lawyer and spin another web of convincing lies. You would claim it fell out of the glove box during the crash. You would manipulate the legal system, just like you always do. So I waited until I had a stage large enough and an audience important enough to trap you in your own disgusting greed." Jamal raised his cane again, pointing it directly at the center of the canvas. "The materials embedded in the exact center of this million-dollar painting are not imported clay or industrial acrylics," Jamal declared. "The focal point of brilliant darkness is the shattered glass faceplate of your custom Rolex watch. The serial number and your personalized engraving are permanently glued into the canvas, facing outward for the entire world to see." Desmond stumbled backward, knocking over a tall cocktail table. The glass surface shattered loudly against the hardwood floor, but nobody in the crowd even blinked. Everyone was staring at the monster who had just publicly confessed to a horrific crime. "You just stood in front of this entire gallery," Jamal continued, taking a massive step forward, backing his father completely into a corner. "You stood in front of these wealthy patrons, this prestigious gallery owner, and that anonymous buyer. You aggressively claimed ownership of the physical materials in this painting. You demanded compensation. You stated unequivocally and repeatedly that the materials belonged to you." Desmond was shaking uncontrollably. He looked wildly around the room, desperately searching for an exit. "No," he stammered, holding his hands up defensively. "I did not mean the glass. I meant the paints. I meant the canvas. It is way too late for that, Desmond," I said, stepping up beside my son, my voice dripping with pure righteous venom. "You claimed the core of the artwork. You claimed the glass. You just publicly claimed ownership of the physical evidence from a felony hit and run." The absolute silence that followed my words was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The oppressive tension completely vanished. Jamal had masterfully orchestrated a public confession to a massive criminal cover-up without a single flaw. Desmond opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely nothing came out. He looked exactly like a fish suffocating on dry land. He stared at the center of the painting, his eyes wide with a terror that was deeply satisfying to witness. The shattered pieces of glass, catching the gallery lights, were no longer a beautiful artistic statement. They were a damning physical testament to his absolute cowardice. He took a stumbling step backward, his expensive leather shoes squeaking loudly against the polished hardwood floor. "That proves nothing," Desmond stammered, his voice dropping into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Anyone could have a broken watch. You probably bought that off the street just to frame me. You are making this all up to ruin my reputation." Jamal did not even flinch. He leaned slightly on his white cane, projecting his deep voice to the absolute back of the room, ensuring every single person heard the undeniable truth. A custom-ordered platinum Rolex Daytona Jamal stated with lethal precision, engraved on the back casing with the phrase, "To the master of my own destiny." Serial number 8472 Alpha 9. You reported it stolen along with the luxury car. You collected a $50,000 insurance payout for the watch alone. My uncle Andre had a private appraiser verify the serial number under a microscope 3 months ago. It is your watch, Desmond, and you just swore on video in front of 50 elite witnesses that it belongs entirely to you. The anonymous buyer, the older distinguished man who had offered $1 million for the painting, began to slowly walk forward. The crowd of wealthy patrons immediately parted for him, completely stunned by the rapidly unfolding drama. He did not look like an impatient billionaire anymore. His entire physical posture shifted. He dropped the silver-handled walking cane, letting it clatter loudly and dramatically against the floor. He reached his hand deep into the inside pocket of his sharply tailored charcoal suit jacket. He pulled out a thick black leather wallet and flipped it open. A heavy gold badge gleamed brightly under the track lighting. "Special Agent Davis," he announced, his voice completely stripped of its previous refined upper-class accent. He sounded exactly like a hardened veteran law enforcement officer. "State Bureau of Investigation, Fraud and Major Crimes Division." Desmond physically recoiled, stumbling backward until his spine hit the exposed brick wall of the gallery. "What is this?" he gasped, looking wildly between the federal agent and his blind son. "This is a setup! This is illegal entrapment! You cannot do this to me!" Agent Davis shook his head, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his back belt loop. "Entrapment implies we coerced you into committing a crime, Desmond. We did absolutely no such thing. You walked into this private gallery entirely on your own accord. You aggressively attempted to extort a blind teenager. And you voluntarily claimed ownership of the physical evidence from a highly classified cold case file." Andre stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Jamal. My brother-in-law looked incredibly proud, his chest puffed out with righteous vindication. "We contacted the authorities 4 months ago," Andre explained, his voice booming with absolute authority. "When Jamal first told me what he found in the wreckage, we knew we had to be incredibly careful. If we just handed the shattered glass to the police, your high-priced lawyers would immediately claim the chain of custody was broken. You would argue the evidence was planted by a bitter ex-wife. We needed you to definitively tie yourself to the physical object without any reasonable doubt." Agent Davis nodded, stepping closer to the trembling coward against the wall. "That is exactly right. We needed you on tape actively claiming the asset. By loudly demanding financial compensation for the raw materials embedded in that painting, you established a direct, undeniable legal link to the crime scene evidence. You completely waived your right to distance yourself from the Rolex. And because you just admitted it belongs to you, we now have the physical proof, placing you directly in the driver's seat during a catastrophic felony hit-and-run." I stood there watching the entire sting operation unfold, my heart pounding with an overwhelming sense of ultimate justice. For 5 agonizing years, I had blamed myself. I had cried myself to sleep, wondering why God had allowed a random drunk driver to destroy my son's life. Knowing that the monster responsible was the very man who had sworn to protect us was a jagged, bitter pill to swallow. But seeing the absolute paralyzing fear taking over Desmond's face was the perfect antidote to my years of silent suffering. Richard Sterling, the aggressive predatory attorney who had threatened to destroy Jamal's career just 20 minutes ago, was moving with astonishing speed. He had already snapped his thick leather briefcase shut, locking the brass clasps with a loud click. He did not say a single word in defense of his client. He did not object to the presence of the undercover agent. He simply wanted to escape the blast radius of this massive criminal explosion. Richard Desmond pleaded, reaching a trembling, desperate hand out toward his lawyer. "Do something. You are my attorney. File an injunction. Stop them from arresting me." Richard Sterling stopped walking just long enough to look Desmond dead in the eyes. "I was your civil attorney for an intellectual property dispute," Richard stated, his voice completely devoid of any professional courtesy or warmth. "I do not practice criminal defense law. Furthermore, you intentionally lied to me about the origin of the physical assets in a deliberate attempt to use my legal firm to commit federal fraud. You have exposed me to severe ethical violations. Our attorney-client relationship is officially terminated effective immediately. Do not ever contact my office again." With that final devastating blow, Richard Sterling turned on his heel and rapidly walked out the heavy glass doors of the gallery, leaving Desmond completely defenseless. The slick lawyer cared only about his own license and his own survival. Desmond was entirely alone. Chloe was standing near the champagne fountain, clutching her cheap knockoff handbag tightly against her chest. Her face was contorted in sheer, unadulterated terror. The glamorous, wealthy lifestyle she had violently stolen from our family was instantly dissolving into dust right before her eyes. The Cabo vacation, the luxury cars, the easy money, it was all completely evaporating. Agent Davis stepped right up to Desmond, securing the cold steel cuffs tightly around his wrists. The sharp metallic clicking sound echoed loudly in the silent room, locking his fate into place. Desmond Thomas Agent Davis recited, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "You are under arrest for felony leaving the scene of an accident causing grievous bodily harm. You are also being charged with massive insurance fraud, filing a false police report, and attempted criminal extortion. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it." "I did not mean for it to happen," Desmond cried out, tears of pathetic self-pity streaming rapidly down his face. "I panicked. The car spun out of control in the rain. I was scared. I knew I would lose everything. I did not want to go to jail." "You left your own son to bleed in the dark!" I screamed, the years of violently suppressed rage finally erupting from my chest. "You left him trapped in crushed metal while you ran away like a coward. You did not lose everything, Desmond. You traded his eyesight for an insurance check and a cheap mistress." Desmond dropped heavily to his knees, pulling weakly against the handcuffs. "Naya, please," he begged, openly sobbing in front of the elite crowd of wealthy art collectors. Tell them I am a good man. I made a mistake. Please do not let them take me away." Jamal stepped forward, tapping his cane sharply against the floor. "A mistake is forgetting a birthday," Jamal said, his deep voice cutting effortlessly through Desmond's pathetic wailing. "A mistake is missing a graduation ceremony, running from a violent crash, leaving your child permanently disabled, and then attempting to steal his life savings 5 years later is not a mistake. It is exactly who you are." Agent Davis yanked Desmond forcefully back to his feet, grabbing him by the collar of his custom-tailored suit. "The statute of limitations for felony insurance fraud and grievous bodily harm in this state is exactly 10 years, the agent explained, pushing Desmond roughly toward the gallery exit. "You thought you were completely in the clear, but you just handed us a perfectly wrapped conviction on a silver platter. You are going to be sitting in a small concrete cell for a very long time." As Desmond was being dragged toward the front doors, Chloe suddenly snapped out of her paralyzed state. She realized the gravy train had completely derailed, and she was about to go down with the sinking ship. She shrieked loudly, dropping her cheap handbag onto the floor. "Do not look at me!" she yelled, holding her hands up defensively as the gallery patrons stared at her in absolute disgust. "I did not know anything about a car crash. I did not know he caused the accident. I just wanted the money. I am a victim here too." Andre let out a sharp, humorless laugh, crossing his massive arms over his chest. "A victim," Andre repeated, shaking his head slowly. "You walked in here an hour ago demanding equity in my sister-in-law's house. You demanded half of my nephew's hard-earned money to fund your vacations. You are no victim, Chloe. You are just a parasite who finally ran out of blood to suck. Now get out of my gallery before I have you arrested as an accessory to extortion." Chloe burst into hysterical theatrical tears. She spun around, her high heels slipping awkwardly on the polished floor, and sprinted out the front doors, desperately trying to distance herself from the catastrophic arrest. She disappeared rapidly into the Atlanta night, leaving behind nothing but the fading, sickening scent of her cheap floral perfume. The flashing red and blue lights of several police cruisers suddenly illuminated the large glass windows of the gallery. The wailing sirens grew incredibly loud as backup units arrived to transport Desmond directly to the county jail. The wealthy patrons who had watched the entire incredible sting operation unfold stood in stunned, absolute silence. And then slowly the applause began. It did not start with the gallery owner or the authorities. It started with the older woman in the red dress standing near the sculpture garden. She clapped her hands together, the sound breaking the heavy, lingering tension. Then another patron joined in. Then another. Within seconds, the entire room was filled with thunderous, roaring applause. It was not polite golf clapping. It was aggressive, celebratory cheering. They were not just applauding the brilliant artwork anymore. They were applauding the absolute triumph of justice and the incredible resilience of a blind young man who had conquered his deepest trauma. Jamal stood firmly in the center of the room, surrounded by the cheering crowd. He lowered his head slightly, a genuine warm smile finally breaking across his handsome face. The immense heavy burden he had carried for 5 years had finally been lifted. He was no longer the tragic victim of a horrific accident. He was the brilliant architect of his own liberation. Desmond was practically being dragged backward through the gallery by Agent Davis and the uniformed backup officers. His expensive custom-tailored suit was wrinkled and disheveled, completely stripped of the arrogant power it had projected just an hour ago. He looked pathetic, struggling against the cold steel handcuffs that dug deeply into his wrists. As they hauled him toward the heavy glass exit doors, he planted his feet desperately against the hardwood floor, turning his tear-streaked face back toward me. "Nia, please!" Desmond screamed, his voice cracking with absolute desperation. "Do not let them do this to me. I am the father of your child. We were a family once. You have to help me. You have to talk to them." I stood completely still, the heavy iron armor of the strong black woman dissolving entirely from my shoulders. I did not need the armor anymore. The battle was completely over, and we had won. I looked at the man who had abandoned us, who had caused 5 years of agonizing pain, and who had just attempted to steal my son's brilliant future. I felt absolutely nothing for him. No anger, no pity. Just a profound, overwhelming sense of closure. I took one slow, deliberate step forward, my voice perfectly level and icy cold. "You walked in here tonight demanding 50% of his work, Desmond," I said, ensuring every single syllable hit him like a physical blow. "You wanted 50% of his talent, his pain, and his success. Well, congratulations. You just got 100% of the consequences." The gallery erupted into cheers once again. The wealthy patrons who had watched the entire incredible saga unfold applauded my final words of absolute defiance. Agent Davis gave a curt, respectful nod in my direction before forcefully shoving Desmond through the exit doors. The heavy glass swung shut, cutting off his pathetic wailing completely. The flashing police lights painted the street outside in vibrant shades of red and blue as they shoved him into the back of a cruiser. Within moments, the sirens faded into the distance, taking the darkest chapter of our lives away forever. The oppressive tension that had suffocated the gallery all night finally broke. Andre let out a massive, booming laugh, wrapping his strong arms around Jamal in a crushing, joyful embrace. "You did it, kid." Andre cheered, his voice thick with overwhelming pride. "You actually did it. You outsmarted the devil himself." Jamal hugged his uncle back, his face glowing with a radiant, victorious smile. "We did it, Uncle Andre," Jamal corrected, his deep voice filled with profound gratitude. "We protected the trust. We protected the art." The anonymous buyer stepped forward, his distinguished face now relaxed into a genuine warm expression. He picked up his silver-handled walking cane from the floor. He extended his right hand toward Jamal, grasping the young man's hand firmly. "It is an absolute honor to meet you, Jamal. The buyer said, his tone dripping with deep respect. And it is my absolute privilege to pay $1 million for Brilliant Darkness. The title is clear. The story is legendary. I will have my bank wire the funds to your trust account first thing tomorrow morning. Jamal bowed his head slightly, acknowledging the incredible life-changing transaction. Thank you, sir. I promise you the artwork will serve as a constant reminder that the truth always comes to light. As the gallery staff quickly moved to clean up the shattered cocktail table, the celebratory atmosphere returned with a massive vengeance. The champagne flowed freely, the jazz music resumed its smooth, lively tempo, and the wealthy patrons lined up to congratulate Jamal not just for his incredible artistic talent, but for his astonishing, brilliant courage. I stood near the edge of the room, watching my son navigate the elite crowd with absolute grace. He was no longer the frightened, traumatized boy sitting in the dark hospital room. He was a wealthy, successful, independent artist who had literally stared down his worst nightmare and emerged completely victorious. I took a deep, cleansing breath, feeling the heavy weight of the past 5 years completely lift from my spirit. The long, sleepless nights, the terrifying foreclosure notices, the endless medical bills, they were all finally over. The nightmare was finished. As I watched Jamal laughing with Andre and the gallery patrons, I realized something incredibly profound about the true meaning of family. Society tells us that family is strictly defined by bloodlines and biology. They tell us we have to forgive toxic behavior simply because someone shares our last name or our DNA. They tell Black women specifically that we must endlessly sacrifice our own peace to protect the fragile egos of the men who consistently let us down. But tonight completely shattered that toxic narrative. Desmond was biologically Jamal's father, but he was nothing more than a dangerous predator. Andre, on the other hand, was the one who showed up. Andre was the one who built the studio, hired the lawyers, and stood fiercely between us and the monsters. Family is not the people who share your genetics. Family is the people who actively choose to protect your peace. It is the people who celebrate your victories and help you meticulously plan your defense when the wolves come knocking at your door. We survived because we refused to be victims. We survived because we used our trauma as fuel to build an impenetrable fortress. And most importantly, we survived because Jamal learned how to turn his darkest, agonizing moments into a brilliant, undeniable masterpiece. If you are listening to this story right now, and you are dealing with a toxic family member who constantly drains your energy and dismisses your boundaries, I want you to hear me clearly. You do not owe them your suffering. You do not owe them your hard-earned success. You have the absolute right to cut the dead weight and protect your own peace. Have you ever had to stand up to a toxic relative who tried to claim credit for your hard work? Have you ever had to set a firm, unbreakable boundary to protect your own mental health and your family's future? I would love to read your incredible stories in the comments section below. If this journey of resilience and ultimate justice resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to hear more authentic stories of overcoming the impossible. Share this video with someone who might need a powerful reminder today that the darkest chapters of our lives often provide the raw materials for our greatest, most beautiful masterpieces. Thank you so much for being part of this incredible journey with me. Keep protecting your peace, keep building your brilliant future, and remember that the best revenge is always a life beautifully and successfully lived.